She stood near the back of Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947, and almost nobody noticed her. World's crowned heads had arrived for the wedding in the full theatrical splendor that royal families mobilize for such occasions. Kings and queens of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Romania, Greece, representatives of dynasties that had survived 2 world wars, a revolution, collapse of several empires, and the general redistribution of Europe that followed all of it, sat in their gilded pews in their tiaras and their decorations and their formal mourning coats. Photographers documented every one of them, because that was what photographers did at royal weddings in 1947, and the faces in the photographs were the faces the newspapers expected to find there. The woman near the back was not one of those faces. She wore a plain grey dress and a small practical hat, no jewels, no decorations, no ermine or silk or any of the visual glamour of royalty that everyone else in the building was fluent in. She was 62 years old. She had the straight back and the composed face of someone who had been trained from birth to manage public situations, and had then spent the 2 decades deciding that management of that kind was less important than she had once believed. Her name was Princess Alice of Battenberg. Groom was her son. The groom stood at the altar in full-dress naval uniform, medals on his chest, bearing of a man who had earned every commendation on display rather than being born to them. He had chosen for this marriage give up his Greek and Danish royal titles and take a British surname derived from his maternal uncle's adopted name. He was Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten now. He had been Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark when he was born on a dining table on the Greek island of Corfu in 1921. He had been multiple other things in between, depending on which country he was in and what the political situation required. This particular morning, he was the man about to marry the heir to the British throne, and the country had already decided. The warmth that British publics bring to naval officers of the right kind of story, that they approved of him. Mother watched from near the back. She did not sit with the foreign royalty. She did not sit in the section reserved for the British royal family. She was in the nave, slightly apart from both groups, in the way that she had been slightly apart from every official gathering she attended during last 2 decades of her life. She had been at the edges of the photograph for so long that the edges had become in their own way her place. People at the wedding saw, if they looked closely enough to notice her at all, an older woman in grey, who seemed to be at a slight remove from the occasion. What they were almost certainly not thinking, because they had no reason to, was that the woman in grey had organized field hospitals during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, while her children, still infants at home, that she had been declared paranoid schizophrenic in 1930 and locked in a Swiss sanatorium for 2 years, against her will by a family that had run out of other responses to the difficulty she was presenting, that she had been subjected, Berlin clinic where she was first held, to a course of high-intensity X-ray treatment directed at her ovaries, and the recommendation of Sigmund Freud, who had diagnosed her religious visions as the product of sexual frustration, and believed that inducing early menopause might correct the problem, that she had spent 2 years in the sanatorium asking to be released and being told no. She had tried to escape at least once, running toward a railway station in Switzerland in July 1932 and been brought back. We're not thinking that this woman, standing in grey near the back of the abbey, lived alone in Athens during the German occupation of Greece and had, in the autumn of 1943, taken in 3 members of a Jewish family and hidden them in the upper rooms of her residence for 13 months, few hundred yards from the Gestapo's Athens headquarters, that she had been interrogated by German officers and had used her deafness she had been born with in this same country 62 years earlier, as a form of protection, tending she could not follow their questions, that she had never mentioned any of this to anyone, not her daughters, not her surviving relatives. The son who was standing at the altar 20 feet from where she stood, the man standing at the altar did not know. He would not know for another 47 years, when he flew to Jerusalem in 1994 and heard the story for the first time from the files of Yad Vashem and the testimony of the surviving members of the family his mother had saved. CTA 1. Before we go any further, if this story is drawing you in the way we think it will, please take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button and the like button below. We cover the hidden stories behind the British royal family here, ones that don't make it into the official record, and the ones that the palace would rather you never investigated. There are a great many of those stories. This one is among the most extraordinary. Stay with us. This is the story of Princess Alice of Battenberg. It runs from Windsor Castle in 1885 to Buckingham Palace in 1969. From a birth in the presence of Queen Victoria to a death in the palace where the Queen Mother lived. From a girl who was born deaf and mastered her disability so completely that almost nobody around her understood what they were watching, to an old woman in grey at the back of a church who had survived more than the people around her had any idea of, is also the story of what happens to a boy when his mother is taken away at 9 years old and replaced by a diagnosis and an institution. That absence builds, over decades, in the person who is left behind, what it costs, what it makes. Philip never forgave the family for what they did to Alice in 1930. He never said this clearly, because Philip was not someone who said the difficult things clearly when a more contained expression was available. The record of his life after 1930, the distances he kept, the walls he built, characteristic impatience with sentiment that people who knew him always remarked on, these things have a beginning. Beginning is a 9-year-old boy in Paris who woke up one morning and was told that his mother had gone to a clinic and would not be coming back for some time, and that the appropriate response was to get on with it. He got on with it. It shaped him in ways that he never fully unwound. Born on the 25th of February 1885 in the tapestry room at Windsor Castle, this was not, context of the Victorian royal family, a particularly unusual birthplace. Windsor Castle was the administrative and emotional centre of the British monarchy, place where Queen Victoria spent the largest portion of her life, and various granddaughters and great-granddaughters and had arrived there over the decades as the family expanded across the continent. But the specific detail is worth noting. Alice was born at the most symbolically central address in the British royal world, in the presence of her great-grandmother. Power was at that point nearly 50 years old and showed no sign of diminishing. Queen Victoria was 65 years old when Alice was born. She had been reigning since 1837. She had outlived her husband, watched her children and grandchildren spread across the thrones of Europe, seen the continent reorganize itself several times, and was by 1885 the matriarch of a dynastic network so sprawling and so interconnected that European royal politics had effectively become a family argument conducted in 4 languages simultaneously. She was present at Alice's birth. She looked at the new baby and expressed, in the formal language she used for such occasions, her satisfaction. Baby was Alice's parents' first child. Her father was Prince Louis of Battenberg, naval officer who had been born in Germany and moved to England, where he had built a distinguished career in the Royal Navy. He was intelligent, capable and popular with the naval establishment, though his German name would eventually be the thing that ended his career. Anti-German sentiment of the First World War made it impossible for a man named Battenberg to remain First Sea Lord of the British Navy. He resigned in 1914, changed the family name to Mountbatten, and died in 1921. His son Louis, Alice's brother, became the Mountbatten, who effectively adopted Philip and managed his career from the shadows of various naval and political offices. Louis of Battenberg had been chosen by history for a particular kind of British life of a naturalized royal who serves the institution of the British Crown with genuine talent and commitment, and who discovers eventually that the institution has limits on how far it will protect him when the political weather changes. He had risen to the highest position available to a naval officer, and he had then been asked by a grateful country to step down, cause his German surname was more visible than his 30 years of distinguished service. He did it without public bitterness. The self-possessed acceptance of a man who understood the institution he served and was not surprised to find its limits. He was, in this way, model of the specific kind of dignity that Alice's family expected of itself. Alice had absorbed and would deploy in forms her father might not have anticipated. Alice's mother was Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Victoria was a sharp, energetic woman who took a practical view of most situations, and who would outlive her daughter by 5 years. Dying in 1950 at the age of 87, she was a good mother in many respects, attentive and organized and genuinely concerned for her children's welfare. She was also the person who, in 1930, gave the instruction that Alice should be transferred from one sanatorium to a second one. The instruction that Alice would describe, years later, things she could not forgive. These 2 things about Princess Victoria are both true. The fact that they are both true is one of the things that makes Alice's story more complicated than a simple narrative of villains and victims. Alice's deafness was not discovered at birth. it would have been at the time difficult to discover at birth. Diagnostic tools available to physicians in 1885 were adequate for many things, but not especially refined for the identification of congenital hearing loss in an infant who was otherwise developing normally. She cried, she fed, she did the things that infants do. Absence of response to sound was interpreted for a time as the inattentiveness that healthy babies sometimes display. It was only as she moved through the months of her first year and then into her second year that the pattern became clear. She did not turn her head towards sounds that other children startled at. She did not respond to her name being called from across a room. Words that other children of her age were beginning to acquire did not seem to be arriving on the same schedule. Physicians who examined her concluded, when she was approximately 4 years old, she had been born with a condition affecting her eustachian tubes that had resulted in complete deafness. There was no treatment, never been a treatment for the specific form of her condition. This was simply the life she would live. What happened next, and what it produced in terms of the person Alice would become, is one of the more remarkable things in a life that was full of remarkable things. She learned to lip read. This is a simplification because the process was not a single decision but a sustained effort over years, and because a 4-year-old does not decide to lip read in the way that an adult decides to learn a language. Alice approached the development of this skill with an intensity and a focus that her tutors and family noted and commented upon. By the time she was 8 years old, she could follow a conversation in English with enough accuracy that someone meeting her for the first time not realize she was doing something that required extraordinary concentration and continuous reconstruction of meaning from visual cues alone. She learned German next because her family was German-speaking on her father's side, and because the world she was growing up in moved between English and German with the fluency of a class that had decided the two languages were simply different registers of the same social world. French followed, because French was the language of European diplomacy and of the drawing rooms where Alice's life was expected to unfold. Greek came later, after her marriage, learned for the same practical reason that she had learned all her languages, because the people she needed to understand were speaking it. By the time Alice was an adult, she could follow a conversation in 4 languages without anyone at the table realizing she was deaf. This was not a trick. Form of total intellectual effort sustained hour after hour, year after year, decade after decade. People who met her socially found her engaged and responsive and perfectly ordinary in her participation. Did not know they were watching one of the most sustained and disciplined acts of compensation in the history of a family not short on disciplined people. She grew up between England, where her father was stationed with the Royal Navy, Germany, where her mother's family was centered, Malta, where the naval postings took the family for stretches of time, gives her early life a quality of movement that would characterize everything that came after. She was never entirely fixed in one place, never entirely the product of one national atmosphere or one royal court. She was from the beginning someone who moved between worlds without fully belonging to any of them. Is both a quality that develops adaptability and a quality that sometimes makes it harder to know, when the moving stops, where you actually are. She was the eldest of 4 children. Her sister Louise was born in 1889. Her brother George came in 1892. Her brother Louis arrived in 1900. Of the siblings, Louis was the one who would have the largest effect on the next generation, becoming the Lord Mountbatten, who served as Philip's informal guardian and who applied to Philip's future the same drive and strategic intelligence applied to everything else. Mountbatten was a person who understood power, who enjoyed it, who was somewhat less attentive to the quieter emotional requirements of family life than to the visible ones. He was present and engaged in Philip's trajectory, which was more than the actual parents managed during the critical years. Alice was educated at home, in the manner of royal daughters of her generation, with tutors for languages and music, and the management of a household. The implicit understanding that the education was preparation for a particular kind of life, rather than for anything so unpredictable as ambition. She went through the forms, but there was always in Alice something that exceeded the forms. Quality of attention that was sharper than the occasion required. A physical energy that would express itself in field hospitals in the Balkan Wars, again in occupied Athens decades apart, with the same directness. She was not a woman designed for sitting still in drawing rooms, and she had been born into a class that spent a significant amount of time in drawing rooms. He met Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark at the coronation of King Edward VII in London in the summer of 1902. She was 17, he was 20. He was the fourth son of King George I of Greece, which placed him at a respectful distance from the actual throne of Greece, but well within the social orbit of European royalty. He had the confidence and the surface charm of a young prince raised in the atmosphere of military prestige. He had been watching Alice across the room, with an attention that was not especially subtle. Alice watched him back. She watched faces the way other people listen to voices, reading the information that surfaces carried. What she read in Andrew's face apparently satisfied her on the most important counts. They were engaged within a short time of the coronation, in a move that struck the people around them as slightly fast but not alarming, and they were married on the 6th of October 1903 in Darmstadt. Wedding took place in Darmstadt, in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, attended by relatives from across the network of European royal houses that the Victorian connections had produced. Alice was 18, Andrew was 21. They were both charming people. Charming people in a room together tend to produce social situations that other people remember warmly. The warmth of the occasion could not prepare either of them for, was the actual nature of what they were embarking on. Was life as a junior royal couple in a country that was never fully at peace with itself. Greece in 1903 was not a stable political environment. Is something that would need to be said approximately a dozen times in any complete account of Alice's life in Greece, because the instability was so constant and so pervasive that it functioned as the atmospheric condition of everything that happened there rather as a particular situation that could be noted and moved past. The Greek royal house was Danish in origin, installed by the great powers in the 1860s as a compromise candidate after years of political chaos, and had been ruling a country that had strong opinions about many things, including whether it wanted to be ruled by Danes who were in any case only technically Greek. King Constantine I, who would eventually be Alice's brother-in-law through Andrew's family, had a particular talent for navigating these waters in ways that kept his position continuously threatened and his relatives' lives continuously complicated. Andrew fell in and out of army command with the rhythms of Greek politics. When one government was in power, he was a respected general. When another came in, he was a problem to be managed. This was the life Alice had married into, and she managed it with the practical intelligence she brought to most situations. She learned Greek, added it to her lip-reading repertoire, adapted to the social world of Athens, and produced children. Margarita was born in 1905, Theodora in 1906, Cecily in 1911, Sophie arrived in 1914. Philip, the only son and the last child, was born on the 10th of June 1921, 7 years after Sophie. The villa at Mon Repos on the eastern shore of Corfu. The girls adored him. He was the baby of a household that had been full of daughters. Daughters took turns carrying him and walking him along the gravel paths beneath the olive trees while the summer light shifted on the water. Family photographs from that period show something that could be mistaken from a distance for ordinary happiness. It lasted approximately 18 months. The Balkan Wars broke out in 1912, a decade after Alice's wedding. Philip was still several years from being born. The oldest daughter, Margarita, was 7. Andrew was reinstated into the army after a period of forced retirement. Greece entered the conflict on the side of the Balkan League against the Ottoman Empire. Alice did not stay home with the children. She went to the front. She organized field hospitals in conditions that required more than organizational skill. The wounded arrived in large numbers. Medical supplies were consistently inadequate. Operations were performed in circumstances that required the people performing them to set aside normal responses to suffering and blood and the sounds of pain and focus on what could be done rather than what could not. Alice worked through the night on multiple occasions. She wrapped bandages herself. She assisted at surgical procedures. She managed the logistics of getting supplies to where they were needed and getting the injured to where they could be treated. Specific conditions of Balkan War medical care were primitive by the standards of what came after and catastrophic by any other standard. Field hospitals in the Balkan campaign of 1912 and 1913 operated without reliable antiseptics, without sufficient surgical personnel, without the transport infrastructure to move casualty efficiently, and without the logistical systems that the major powers had been developing. Since the Crimean War, the mortality rates from wound infection alone were significant. Mortality rates from dysentery and typhoid, in camps sanitation was inadequate, were worse. Alice was in these conditions managing the allocation of inadequate resources to address demands that exceeded them. Is the specific situation that medical logistics always produces in wartime, and which Alice had not previously encountered but took to, with the applied intelligence she brought to every practical problem. She was 27 years old. She had 4 children at home in Athens, youngest still an infant. She had been born deaf and had spent her life constructing an approximation of normal hearing from the shapes of mouths, logic of social situations. She was also, by every account that survived, one of the most useful people in those field hospitals. The most elegant or the most ceremonially appropriate, the most useful. King George V, her father's cousin, awarded her the Royal Red Cross in 1913, the decoration given to nurses who had performed notable service during active military operations. She was the first member of her generation of the royal family to earn a military commendation through actual service, rather than through the ceremonial affiliations that royals accumulated without doing anything in particular to justify them. The award meant something to Alice in a way that the tiaras and the formal honours of royal life did not. Preference would become more pronounced over the decades as she moved further from the world that had produced the tiaras and closer to the work that had produced the Red Cross. The First World War arrived the following year. Its effects on Alice's family were both immediate and catastrophic in ways that she had no way to fully anticipate. Her husband's family, Greek royals, were not uniformly aligned with the Allied cause. King Constantine of Greece, whose wife was the Kaiser's sister, pursued a policy of neutrality that his Prime Minister Venizelos and the Allied powers increasingly regarded as secret German sympathies. Resulting political crisis divided Greece and damaged the royal family's credibility with Britain and France in ways that would prove lasting. Alice and her children sheltered in the palace cellars in December 1916, while French and British ships fired on the city she had lived in for 10 years. The bombardment of Athens in December 1916 was one of the stranger episodes of the First World War, in which Allied ships opened fire on the capital of a neutral country as a political demonstration of their determination to end that country's neutrality. The Greek royalists, who had been attempting to hold the city, responded with gunfire of their own. The city was not significantly destroyed, but the message was effectively communicated. Allies were not prepared to accept continued Greek neutrality and were willing to use direct military force to end it. Alice was in the palace cellars during a naval bombardment ordered by her own father's country. Father had just been forced to resign his position as First Sea Lord because his German name had become a political liability in Britain. Husband's family was being denounced in the Allied press. Her brother Louis, serving with the British Navy, watching his country fire on his sister's city. The specific geometry of competing loyalties that Alice inhabited in December 1916 required a kind of stillness in the face of contradiction that she had been developing, without necessarily knowing that was what she was doing. She was a child. By June 1917, Constantine's position had become impossible. He abdicated. Greek royal family went into their first major exile of the century. Alice went with them to Switzerland, her daughters ranging in age from 3 to 12. Philip had not been born yet. The family returned in 1920. Constantine was restored to the throne following a referendum. It was in this restored Greece in the summer of 1921, on Corfu, Philip was born. He arrived in the world with 4 older sisters and parents who had already navigated more upheaval than most families counter in a generation. The villa at Monrepos was sun-warmed and pleasant, and the summer of Philip's birth was in the family photographs of the few periods of his childhood that looked like what people imagine a childhood should look like. It lasted, as has been noted, approximately 18 months. In September 1922, the Greek army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Turkish forces at Smyrna, ending the Greco-Turkish War with a completeness that left no room for negotiation. Military government that took power in Athens arrested the people it held responsible. Andrew had commanded a corps during the failed campaign. Put on trial for high treason, 5 of the other officers tried alongside him were taken out and shot. Andrew expected to follow them. Trial was conducted in the atmosphere of a military government that had come to power through the specific crisis it was now adjudicating. Officers responsible for the Smyrna disaster were the people who could most usefully be blamed for it. Blaming them served the purposes of the new government in the ways that such processes always serve such purposes. Charges against Andrew were specific. He had disobeyed orders during the campaign. had failed to support adjacent units when ordered, contributed by his inaction to the collapse of the Greek position. Whether these charges accurately described what had happened, or whether they described a situation in which Andrew had been given impossible orders with inadequate resources, and had managed the impossibility as he could, was a question the trial was not primarily interested in answering. He was convicted. Banishment was the sentence rather than death, possibly because executing a prince with British royal connections was an act with international consequences that even a revolutionary government preferred to avoid. But before the verdict was announced, the situation had been sufficiently uncertain that Alice and the children had spent several weeks in a state of waiting that had no comfortable resolution available. Alice waited. She had learned over the previous 20 years how to wait in situations that had no comfortable resolution. This was not the first time she had sat in an uncomfortable position while powerful institutions made decisions about the people she loved. It would not be the last. She was present in Athens during Andrew's trial. She was watching from the particular perspective of a woman who read lips and faces and the body language of people in rooms, what was happening to the family she had built in the country she had come to as a bride and tried to make her own. Andrew expected to follow them. British intervened. King George V dispatched a naval officer named Gerald Talbot to Athens to negotiate quietly with the new Greek government. British warship HMS Calypso was sent to collect the family and take them out of Greece before Andrew's expected execution could be carried. The story that attached itself to this rescue, in every subsequent telling, centered on the image of the infant Philip being placed in a makeshift cot constructed from an orange crate and carried aboard the ship. It is an image vivid enough to function as a metaphor. Philip himself seemed to regard it with the sardonic detachment he brought to most things about his early life. The Prince in the Fruit Crate. Title without the substance. The beginning that contained, in small and concentrated form, the pattern that would define the years ahead. Departure from Greece was for Alice the second major exile of her life. She had left in 1917 when Constantine abdicated. She had come back in 1920 when the referendum restored him, and she had built, in those 2 years of the Second Greek period, household at Mon Repos on Corfu and the life that had produced Philip. Now she was leaving again, time from a country that had formally convicted her husband and expelled the entire family under circumstances that made return, at least in the near term, impossible. She was 37 years old. She had 4 daughters ranging in age from 8 to 17 and an infant son she was carrying aboard a British warship in conditions that can charitably be described as improvised. She did not speak in any documented way about what those days felt like. She was characteristically focused on the practical requirements of the situation. Children needed to be fed and kept calm and accommodated in the limited space of a warship had not been designed for refugee transportation. Andrew needed to be managed in whatever way Andrew could be managed, was imperfectly and with diminishing returns. The orange crate needed to serve as a crib. Alice managed these things in the way she managed everything, with application, without ceremony, without apparent dwelling on the larger catastrophe that the practical requirements were sitting inside. Calypso evacuated them to Corfu first, and then to Brindisi in southern Italy, and eventually the family made their way to France. Alice was leaving behind a country she had lived in for 19 years, a house she had turned into a home, a language she had learned to lip-read, network of people and organizations and charitable work that she had been building since her 20s. She was taking with her a husband who had already begun the slow withdrawal that would eventually complete itself in Monaco, and 5 children, 44 pieces of luggage that the contemporary accounts note were all she retained of the possessions of a princess. They went to Paris. Andrew had been stripped of his rank, his Greek citizenship, and the professional identity he had spent his adult life constructing. He was exiled in the specific way that failed royal officers are exiled, which is to say that the exile was total in practical terms while retaining, barely, the surface appearance of dignity. He was still Prince Andrew. He was still married to Princess Alice. He was also a man in his early 40s with no country, no career, no income to speak of, and no obvious path back to any of it. Settled in St. Cloud, a suburb of Paris, in a house borrowed from a relative, was how the displaced royalty of Europe spent the 1920s, in borrowed houses in the nicer suburbs of Paris, living on reduced means and the goodwill of cousins with more money than they had, trying to present the appearance of temporary inconvenience while working out whether the inconvenience was in fact permanent. Philip was 2 years old when the family reached Paris. He would be 9 when it fell apart. Paris in the 1920s was, of course, an extraordinary place to be if you had the money to engage with what was happening there. The decade that produced Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Picasso was the same decade that produced Andrew's gambling habits and Alice's increasingly isolated inner life and Philip's early education in the fundamental unreliability of everything. Philip attended an American school run by a man named Donald McJanet, who would remember him in later years as an exceptionally bright and physically energetic boy with a tendency to be pleased with his own intelligence. The tendency was not entirely unfounded. Philip was genuinely fast, genuinely able, genuinely ahead of most of the children around him in the speed at which he processed situations and responded to them. He moved through McJanet's school with the ease of someone who had been given, by his particular circumstances, an early education in adaptation. The household was deteriorating. Andrew was not someone who had been designed for the specific combination of enforced idleness and reduced means Paris exile produced. He had been trained for command, for active service, particular masculine rituals of a military career in a royal house. He had none of that now. He drank more, he spent time at cards. He began a relationship with a French countess named André de la Bigne that was conducted with enough openness to make Alice's position in the household clear to anyone paying attention. He drifted toward what the household could not sustain and away from what it needed. Alice was in the household trying to sustain it. She had 4 daughters moving through adolescence and young adulthood, one small son who needed what children need from their mothers. She also had increasingly sense that the life she was living was a long distance from the life she had imagined at 18 when she married Andrew and came to Athens. Marriage had worked for a while, then the political weather and Andrew's own retreat had taken it apart piece by piece. What was left in St. Cloud in the mid-1920s was the shell of something that had once been more. The daughters were growing. Margarita was in her 20s by 1926, Theodora was 20, Cecily was 15, Sophie was 12, Philip was 5. Occupied a borrowed house in a suburb of a city that was magnificent and indifferent to them, in reduced circumstances that required careful management and produced, in the children, particular social competence of people who have learned that the resources available to them are not what they appear from the outside, and that managing this gap is a continuous requirement. Alice managed it with the characteristic combination of organization and suppressed interior strain would eventually produce the breakdown the family had been trying to avoid. She managed the household finances. She managed the girls. She managed Philip. She managed, as she had been managing since she was a child in a hearing world, gap between what the world was presenting to her and what she could access of it. She managed the additional gap between what her life was and what the people observing it could see. Andrew was not managing any of it. He was somewhere else, figuratively and increasingly literally. By the late 1920s, he was spending extended periods away from St. Cloud. Countess had become his permanent companion in all but formal announcement. Alice was the mother in a household that no longer had the structure she had organized her adult life around. The interior resources she had been drawing on were beginning to run thin. Alice turned toward religion. She had been Protestant through the years of her marriage, maintaining the faith she had been raised in, while living in an overwhelmingly Orthodox country. In 1928, something shifted. She became increasingly absorbed in religious practice. She read theology. She spent time in meditation and prayer. She converted to the Greek Orthodox Church in 1928 at the age of 43, a move that her family took as unexpected but not in itself alarming. It made a certain sense in context. She had spent 25 years in a Greek Orthodox country, had worshipped alongside Orthodox family members, had found in the liturgy and the iconography and the particular texture of Orthodox religious life something that resonated with the internal world she was constructing. The conversion was not a social act. It was not a dynastic maneuver or an expression of loyalty to Andrew's country or a public statement of any kind. It was a private act done because Alice had arrived at a conviction and acted on it. Orthodox Church's particular combination of mystical practice and physical ritual, incense and the chanting and the icons, and the specific quality of stillness in Orthodox contemplation, something that Alice had been observing from the outside for 2 decades and had finally decided she was not willing to continue observing from outside. What alarmed the family was what came alongside the conversion. Alice began to describe experiences that sounded people around her, like something other than conventional religious devotion. She told her family that she had received a sign, told them she possessed a photograph that had been signed by Christ. She described experiences of divine communication that were intense and specific, and that she spoke about with the calm certainty of someone who had chosen to believe something but had simply observed it happening. Her mother, Princess Victoria, wrote in correspondence in 1930 that she believed Alice was experiencing anemia of the brain from too much contemplation. It was not a medical opinion. It was an Edwardian gentlewoman's way of saying that something had gone wrong in her daughter's mind, and that it preferable to frame it in terms that implied a physical cure was available. Family discussed the situation with the growing alarm that people discussed situations when the situation is already more serious than the discussions are acknowledging. Alice was withdrawing from social obligations. She was absent from events she was expected to attend. She was conducting herself in a manner that did not correspond to what was expected of a woman of her position. In early 1930, the decision was made. Alice would be persuaded to visit a clinic in Berlin for an examination. She was told it was a rest. She was told the doctors wanted to see how she was. She agreed, because she had been agreeing to the reasonable requests of the people around her all her life, and because she perhaps believed that an examination would confirm what she herself believed, was that she was entirely sane and could be discharged immediately. The clinic was Kurhaus Schloss Tegel on the outskirts of Berlin, operated on broadly psychoanalytic principles, and was directed by a psychiatrist named Ernst Simmel, who was among the more credentialed practitioners of the era, a former associate of Freud's who had worked with military trauma cases during the First World War and had established the Tegel Clinic as a place where serious psychiatric work was done. Alice was admitted in the winter of 1930. 44 years old, she had a husband, 4 daughters, and a 9-year-old son. Admission process at Tegel involved the standard procedures of European institutional psychiatry of the era, a series of examinations, interviews about her history and current state, assessment of her behavior and responses, documentation of her presenting symptoms. Alice went through these procedures with the cooperation of someone who believed they were going to demonstrate what she believed. She was entirely well and should be allowed to go home. The examination produced a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia instead. Diagnosis was presented to the family rather than to Alice herself, in the manner of an era in which the patient's own assessment of their condition was not considered a primary source of diagnostic information. Diagnosis was communicated to Alice as a conclusion rather than an hypothesis, not presented as something she could contest or contribute to. It was a determination made by credentialed men based on criteria she was not shown, and it was used to justify keeping her in a place she had not agreed to stay in. Alice's response to this situation was characteristically clear. She said she was not ill. She said she was entirely sane. She said this repeatedly. Logical and well-organized way of someone whose thinking was entirely coherent. The coherence was noted in the clinical records. It was noted as an interesting clinical feature, rather than as evidence that the diagnosis might be wrong. In the framework Simmel and then Binswanger were working within, the ability to present a coherent case for your own sanity was not a disqualifier. The diagnosis. It was in certain formulations consistent with the presenting condition. Simmel wrote to Freud about the case. Freud was, 1930, in his mid-70s, the most famous psychologist in the world, a person to whom European psychiatric establishments turned when they had cases they considered either diagnostically complex or diplomatically significant. Alice was both in an asylum was an unusual patient. Diagnosis of religious delusions in a woman of her background and education was something Freud had opinions about. Freud believed that Alice's religious experiences were the expression of an unresolved erotic conflict, conclusion consistent with his general theory of neurosis and one he applied with a frequency that his critics found excessive. He had a treatment in mind. It was not a psychoanalytic treatment. It was a physical intervention derived from theories about the relationship between hormonal function and mental state that were fashionable in certain European medical circles during the 1920s. Endocrinological school believed that mental disturbances in middle-aged women had hormonal roots, that addressing the hormonal situation could address the mental one. Freud recommended that Alice's ovaries be exposed to high-intensity X-ray radiation, with the goal of inducing premature menopause. theory that reducing her hormonal activity would reduce the intensity of the mental experiences manifesting as religious delusions. Recommendation was adopted. There is no record that Alice was asked whether she wished to undergo this treatment. There is no record of a consent procedure recognizable under any modern medical or ethical framework. There is ample record of the fact that she was in an institution, that her family had authorized her care. The leading psychiatric mind of the era had suggested a course of action. In the framework of 1930, facts together constituted sufficient justification to proceed. The X-ray treatment was administered. It produced, according to what could subsequently be reconstructed from medical correspondence and Alice's own later descriptions, severe physical side effects that affected her health for years. Whether it produced any clinical improvement in the religious experiences it was intended to address is unclear from the surviving records. What is clear is that Alice continued to believe, throughout the period of her treatment and the years of confinement that followed, she was entirely sane, and that the people holding her were wrong. She stated this clearly and repeatedly, and with the logical structure of someone whose thinking was perfectly coherent. The clarity and logic were noted in the clinical records, and noted and not acted upon. Shortly after the Tegel treatment, Alice's mother Victoria arranged for her to be transferred to a different institution. Reasoning given was that a change of setting might be beneficial. The destination was the Bellevue Sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, run by the psychiatrist Ludwig Binswanger. Binswanger was a respected figure who had corresponded with Freud but maintained his own theoretical positions, and who ran an institution with a reputation for humane treatment by the standards of the era. Alice was transferred to Kreuzlingen on the 1st of May 1930. She was admitted against her stated wishes. Records that Binswanger kept describe a patient who was at times outwardly composed and at other times deeply distressed, engaged with the treatment regime selectively and resentfully, who stated clearly and repeatedly that she believed herself to be well and wished leave, and who was refused permission to leave because her family had not authorized her release. She asked for holidays from the institution. Refused. She asked for visits from her children. These were controlled and limited. She asked to attend her daughter Cecily's wedding in February 1931 and was not permitted to go. She celebrated her 46th birthday at Kreuzlingen in February 1931, refusing to speak to Binswanger at all. Daughter Margarita married in April 1931. Alice was not there. Theodora married in August 1931. Alice was not there. Cecily had married in February 1931. Alice was not there. Sophie married in December 1930. Alice was not there. All four daughters were married while their mother was in an institution she had not chosen and was not permitted to leave. Daughters' new lives began in the absence of the person who had produced them. Alice was at Kreuzlingen asking to go home while her children were getting married and moving into the houses they would spend the rest of their lives in. What Binswanger wrote in his notes about Alice's behavior has a quality that is instructive about the logic of institutional psychiatry of era. He noted that her protests were inconsistent with the expected responses of a recovering patient. He noted that the religious aspects of her thinking remained dominant. He noted that she was planning escapes. He did not note, because the framework he was working within did not provide language for it. Refusing to speak to the person keeping you imprisoned on your birthday might be a rational expression of justified anger rather than evidence. Continuing illness, that protesting your incarceration clearly and repeatedly might be evidence of sanity rather than pathology. Planning to escape from a place you were held against your will was something that a reasonable person might do. Her mother came to visit. It was during this visit that Binswanger told Alice she could not be released without Victoria's permission. Alice reportedly froze when she heard this. Something settled in her face that stayed settled for years afterward. She never forgave her mother for being the person who held the key to the door and decided not to use it. Andrew visited once. One visit during the entire period of Alice's confinement. He came after Margarita's wedding in April 1931, stopped at the sanatorium briefly, and left. Whatever passed between them during that visit is not in the record. What the visit's brevity and singularity says is clear enough. Marriage was over. Andrew had retreated to the south of France, and the company of the French countess who had become his companion. He was not going to be the person who intervened. He came once, and then he did not come again. Philip was 9 when Alice was taken to the clinic in Berlin. He was moved to live with his maternal grandmother, Princess Victoria. He was then enrolled at Cheam Preparatory School in England. He was sent to Salem in Germany. He went to Gordonstown in Scotland. He moved through the system of schools and relatives that the adults around him had organized for him. He adapted to each new arrangement with the adaptability of a child who had been learning since birth that stability was not something that could be assumed. What it was to be 9 years old and have this happen is something the record does not fully preserve because Philip did not discuss it. People around him at the time left no detailed accounts of what he said or showed of what he was feeling. Clinical picture has to be inferred from the behavior of the adult he became, and inference is not certainty. What is known is that Philip, on arriving at Cheam, was a boy who had already demonstrated considerable resilience and adaptability across a childhood that had required both. He had been exiled from Greece as an infant. He had lived in a borrowed house in Paris, with a father who was withdrawing from the family and a mother who was withdrawing from the world. He had learned, by some combination of instruction and observation, and the self-protective instincts of a child, in an unstable environment, that the appropriate response to an unfamiliar situation was to assess it quickly and find the most functional position in it as fast as possible. He arrived at Cheam and he assessed it and he found his position. The teachers noted his abilities. Housemaster noted his energy. His contemporaries noted that he was both funny and somewhat impenetrable on the matters that most needed penetration. He was good at things that were visible, and good at things that were competitive, and good above all, performance of being entirely fine. Whether he was entirely fine is a question that no one thought to ask him at the time, because entirely fine was what was being asked for, and he was delivering it. His mother was in a sanatorium in Switzerland, asking to be released and being refused. Letters between Princess Victoria and the staff at Kreuzlingen include references to Philip during this period, brief ones, noting that he was at school, that he was doing well, that there was no reason to trouble him with the details of his mother's condition. Whether the letters between Victoria and Alice during this period included discussion of Philip is not fully preserved. What is preserved is that Philip and Alice were not in contact during the years of her confinement, in ways that would have allowed him to understand what was happening or to say what he needed to say about it. He was 9 and then 10 and then 11 and then 12, and his mother was somewhere in Switzerland, and the adults had decided that the best approach was to protect him from the information by providing none of it. In July 1932, Alice attempted to escape from Kreuzlingen. She jumped for a window, got through it, ran toward the nearby railway station. She was caught while waiting for the train. When she was returned to the institution, told the staff that she was fed up being a princess. These were, according to the accounts that have survived in various secondary sources, drawing on the contemporaneous records, approximately her words, fed up being a princess. The phrasing was exactly that or something close to it. The sentiment is entirely coherent as the statement of a woman who had been told, in effect, that the management of her identity as a princess required her to remain in an institution against her will indefinitely, who had found this arrangement unacceptable. She continued to plan escapes. She told her nurse directly that she would keep planning them until one succeeded. She left Kreuzlingen in the autumn of 1932, transferring at the recommendation of the Queen of Italy, Elena of Montenegro, to the Martinsbrunn Sanatorium in South Tyrol. At Martinsbrunn, given substantially more freedom, she improved in the sense that the most acute expressions of her distress receded, leaving behind a woman who was still deeply resentful toward her family and still disconnected from the social obligations of her pre-breakdown life, who was no longer planning escapes and no longer presenting the daily challenge she had presented at Kreuzlingen. The improvement was genuine. Setting was gentler, the supervision less constant, the atmosphere more like a sanatorium in the recuperative sense rather than the custodial one. Alice was 57 years old, and the years of institutional life had taken whatever acute expression her religious experiences had had in 1930 and settled them into something she could manage and present as manageable. Whether this constituted recovery in the clinical sense or simply the adjustment of a person who had decided that performing recovery was the most efficient path toward being released is a question the records can't fully resolve. She made a friend there, a Swedish woman named Miss Halskoff, who became first her companion and then her secretary. In early 1933, left Martinsbrunn together and settled in Nervi on the Italian Riviera. For the next several years, Alice was largely nomadic, moving between small towns in Italy and elsewhere, mostly out of contact with her children, occasionally in correspondence but not frequently in person. The Italian years were years of reconstruction in the specific sense that Alice was rebuilding the habits and routines of life outside an institution. She had been in some form of institutional care or supervised living for nearly 3 years, which is long enough that the ordinary requirements of independent life, finding accommodation, managing money, deciding how to spend a day, feel unfamiliar. She was doing this in a foreign country, without her family, with one companion. Whatever financial resources Victoria and the wider family were providing, the continuing task of managing her own state in a world that had decided her state was unreliable. Her mother wrote, in the summer of 1935, Alice was physically well but mentally no better. This assessment was delivered from a distance. A woman who was reading the continued estrangement as evidence of ongoing illness rather than as the understandable refusal of someone who had wrongly imprisoned to immediately forgive the people who had imprisoned her. Some contact gradually resumed at the end of 1936. Alice wrote to Cecily to thank her for a photograph of a newborn grandchild and of Philip. By 1937 she was at a place called Breibach. In spring of that year she had lunch with Cecily's husband and Philip, in Bonn. First time she had seen any of her children in 4 years. Tragedy came almost immediately after. On the 16th of November 1937, Bina Airlines flight left Frankfurt bound for London. On board were Princess Cecily and her husband Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse, their 2 youngest sons Ludwig and Alexander, Georg's mother Eleanor, and several other passengers. Cecily was 8 months pregnant. They were travelling to London for the wedding of Georg's brother Prince Ludwig to Margaret Campbell Geddes. Weather over the North Sea and the Belgian coast was catastrophic. Heavy fog, kind that reduces visibility to a few feet and makes every approach an act of calculation rather than sight. Plane attempted its scheduled stop in Brussels, but the conditions were too severe. The pilot diverted to the airport at Ostend, nearest alternative. Cecily had gone into labor on the plane. The pilot was trying to get the aircraft down quickly. Fog at Ostend was as bad as the fog everywhere else. The airport was on flat ground south of the city, kind of terrain that fog fills completely and uniformly, without the visual landmarks that pilots use in conditions of limited visibility. The Bina Junkers Ju-52 was an experienced aircraft for the era, a reliable trimotor that had accumulated a safety record across the 1930s. But it was attempting an approach in conditions that were at or beyond the limit of what any aircraft of its type could safely manage in a decade. Somewhere on the approach to Ostend, in the fog that had turned the normal geography of the Belgian coastline into an unknowable darkness, the plane struck the brick chimney of a factory. The collision tore away the wing and an engine. The plane fell. All 11 people on board were killed. When the emergency crews reached the wreckage, they found among the dead the body of a newborn baby. Cecily had given birth in the final moments before the impact. The child did not survive. The German press covered the tragedy extensively. British press covered it. It was, by the standards of 1937, a major story. A pregnant princess, her husband the hereditary Grand Duke, children, all killed in a Belgian fog. The specific horror of the newborn found in the wreckage was the detail that pressed itself most deeply into the newspaper coverage and into the memory of the people who read it. Alice was informed. She had been in something like regular communication with Cecily since 1936. She had had lunch with Cecily in Bonn that spring. She had been in the process, slowly and carefully, of rebuilding the relationship that the years of institutions, and then the years of Italian exile, had interrupted. She received the news and she went to Darmstadt. Philip was 16 years old. He was at Gordonstoun when the news arrived. Attended the funeral in Darmstadt on the 23rd of November, in a Germany that had been Nazi for 4 years. Photographs from the funeral are among the most discussed images of Philip's early life, because they show him standing in dark coats among mourners, some of whom are in SS uniform, some of whom are visible performing the Nazi salute. He is 16, his closest sister is dead. He had not seen his mother in years. He would see her at this funeral. In the ruins of the worst week of the family's recent life, for the first time since she had been taken to the clinic in Berlin and never come home. Specific circumstances of that reunion deserve some attention. Alice had been institutionalized when Philip was 9. He had been told, the indirect way that families communicate about difficult things, that she was ill. He had spent 7 years at schools and with relatives while she was in sanatoriums and then in Italian towns and then gradually back toward something that looked like a normal life. He had seen her in 1937 for lunch in Bonn with Cecily, the first time in 4 years. Then, within months, Cecily was dead, and he was standing in Darmstadt in November 1937, seeing Alice again in circumstances of total devastation. What they had to say to each other at that funeral was necessarily incomplete. Setting did not allow for the conversations that would have addressed the history between them. Darmstadt funeral was a public occasion in a foreign country, attended by several hundred people, some of whom were in SS uniform, all of whom were processing the sudden deaths of multiple family members simultaneously. Philip was 16 and had just lost his sister, and he was surrounded by the specific combination of German royalty and Nazi party presence that made 1937 funeral photographs so politically charged to subsequent viewers. Alice was there, Philip was there, Andrew was there. Arriving from the south of France for this occasion, the only occasion apparently significant enough to draw him back. Three of them stood in the same space for 1 week in Darmstadt, a family that had been taken apart by politics and diagnosis and institutional authority and Andrew's own failures, briefly reassembled by grief. Philip had been 9 when she was taken away. He was 16 now. She had last seen him when he was a boy. He was now, in bearing and size, already the man he was becoming. Alice looked at her son, who she had not raised, who had been raised by schools and relatives and the institutional structures that had been arranged for him, and who was already carrying himself with the self-possession of someone who had learned that self-possession was the only reliable shelter available to him. Whatever she felt at that observation, she did not record it. Neither of them recorded much of anything about those days. Family returned from Darmstadt to their separate locations, and Philip went back to Gordonstoun, and Alice went back to wherever she was staying. The week ended in the way that all weeks end, with the living making their way to the next thing. Gordonstoun had been working on him for 2 years by the time of Cecily's death. School's working had found a material in Philip that was unusually well suited to what it was trying to produce. Kurt Hahn, German Jewish educational reformer who had founded the school, had built his educational philosophy around the conviction that the worst thing you could do for a young person was protect them from difficulty, cold water, physical challenge, community service, demands of seamanship and rescue operations, the management of exhaustion and cold, and the insistence that you could do more than you thought you could do. The idea was to produce people who could operate at their best when things were at their worst. Philip had been operating under that condition since approximately the age of 2. Better prepared for Gordonstoun than Gordonstoun was prepared for him. The school occupied a Scottish country house on the Moray Firth, in a landscape that was cold and flat and prone to weather that came off the North Sea, with an enthusiasm that had no particular concern for the preferences of the people it was being enthusiastic at. The Gordonstoun program involved rising early, cold showers, physical exercise before lessons, afternoon sports, evening community service of various kinds, regular seamanship training on the waters of the Moray Firth in conditions that a sensible adult would have described as inadvisable. Program was designed to strip away the specific kind of softness that Hahn believed privileged European youth were prone to replace it with the specific kind of self-reliance that he believed they needed in a world that was becoming rapidly more violent. Philip was head boy by the time he finished Gordonstoun. He was captain of the cricket team. He was the school's most visible student. He had also been, for the 6 years of his secondary schooling, a boy without a mother in any practical sense, without a father who functioned as a father, and without any of the private warmth and domestic stability that most people's childhoods provide as background condition of whatever else is happening. He had Gordonstoun's cold water and community service. He had Mountbatten's letters and occasional visits. He had the specific companionship of other boys in the same unusual situation. Teachers described him as brilliant and physically courageous and faster than almost everyone around him. He captained sports teams. He excelled at sailing. He was funny in the way that highly intelligent people under pressure are funny, which is to say the humor came from an accurate and somewhat merciless reading of situations that other people were pretending not to notice. He was also, by every account that survived, someone who did not allow people easily past the public face he had constructed. Close friend, who was not a careful observer, might have thought they knew Philip well and have actually known very little about what was happening. Inside him, the emotional distance was already formed. It had been forming since 1930. 9-year-old boy who wakes up and finds that his mother has been taken away, and his father has removed himself to the south of France, and his sisters are getting married to German princes, does not become an emotionally open adult. He becomes something else. Something capable and competent and genuinely impressive in many respects, and very, very practiced at needing nothing from the people who might fail him. The Nazi connections of Philip's sisters were complicated in the way that most things involving family loyalty and political complicity are complicated, which is to say that they were in some respects worse than they looked, and in others more comprehensible than historical distance makes them appear. Cecily's husband, Georg Donatus of Hesse, had been a Nazi party member. Sophie's husband, Christoph of Hesse, had been both a Nazi party member and an SS officer, and would die in 1943 in a Luftwaffe crash while on active service for the German military. Theodora's husband, Berthold of Baden, had a more equivocal relationship to the regime than his brothers-in-law. Sisters themselves are harder to assess from the distance of the present. Had married into German aristocratic families in the early 1930s. Nazi movement was consolidating its hold on German political life, and when the specific nature of what it would become was not yet entirely clear to everyone living inside it, the marriages had been arranged, or at least facilitated, through the social networks of European royal families that had been operating on the principle of dynastic intermarriage for generations. German princes who had become their husbands were not, at the time of the marriages, internationally notorious as the men they would become. The sisters were living through in the years Alice was in Kreuslingen was the specific experience of being well-born German women married to men who were entangled with the Nazi Party in a country that was consuming itself and its neighbors with an efficiency that made the initial judgments, 1930s, look increasingly indefensible. Some of them appear to have maintained a form of political detachment from what their husbands were doing. None of them have left records of significant resistance to it. This was not unusual for women of their class and era, and it was also not admirable, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. What it meant for Alice, sanatorium in Kreuslingen, and then from her nomadic years in Italy, and then from Athens, that the family she had produced had ended up distributed across the landscape of the most catastrophic political event in European history in conditions that ranged from awkward to actively compromised. 4 of her children had married into German aristocratic families with Nazi affiliations. Her one son was fighting on the Allied side. She herself would end up sheltering Jews from the regime her daughter's husbands served. Family that Alice's marriage to Andrew had produced was, by the late 1930s, kind of microcosm of European royalty's own catastrophic entanglement with the forces that would destroy most of it. Philip had spent time at Salem in 1933, the year Hitler came to power, the year after the school's Jewish founder Kurt Hahn fled Germany. He had watched what was happening to the country from inside a German school. He was sent to Gordonstown in Scotland, following Hahn, before he was old enough to be required to take a position on any of it. At Cecily's funeral in 1937, he is photographed in the company of men in SS uniform. He was 16 years old and attending his sister's burial. Whatever position he held at that moment was the position of a grieving boy rather than a political actor. The photographs have been used in subsequent decades as ammunition in arguments about Philip's early sympathies, arguments that ignore both his age and the structural impossibility of attending your sister's funeral in Nazi Germany in 1937 without standing near Nazis. His sisters did not attend his wedding in 1947. The official reason was that their German connections in the immediate post-war atmosphere, their presence politically impossible. This was true as far as it went. Also meant that Philip stood at the altar in November 1947 without a single sibling present, with his father dead in Monaco since December 1944, with his mother alone in grey near the back of the nave. He was alone in the way that he had learned to be alone. With complete composure, considerable cost, Alice returned to Greece in 1938. She settled in Athens in a small flat and began the work of re-establishing a life in the city she had left 16 years earlier under the worst possible circumstances. City had changed, the political situation had changed, as the political situation in Greece always did, but Athens was Athens. People were the people she had known in her 20s and 30s, and the Orthodox Church was the church she had converted to. Work of helping the poor was available in the way that such work is always available in a city that has been periodically devastated. Greece Alice returned to in 1938 was a country under the dictatorship of General Ioannis Metaxas, seized power in 1936 with the blessing of King George II, had established an authoritarian government modelled loosely on the fascist states of Europe. The Metaxas regime censored the press, suppressed political opposition, ran on a combination of Greek nationalism and anti-communist paranoia. For Alice's purposes, political climate was less immediately relevant than the social and charitable landscape she was entering, which remained, always had been in Athens, one of significant need and limited institutional capacity. She organized charities for refugees. She visited hospitals. She worked with the Red Cross, which she had worked with before in the Balkan Wars. She had been thinking for years. The nursing sisterhood she intended to found, modeled on the order her aunt Grand Duchess Elizabeth had established in Moscow before the revolution. Elizabeth had been murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918, thrown alive into a mineshaft, had become a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church. Alice thought about her aunt, and what her aunt had built and what it had cost her aunt to build it. She was a 53-year-old woman who had been in institutions and then in Italian towns and then nowhere in particular. She was coming back to the country she had chosen for herself and to the work she had decided was hers to do. Flat she took was small and not palatial, which suited her. She had been living simply for years and had no interest in the expensive accommodations that her royal status might have entitled her to expect. She wanted to be in Athens in her church doing her work. She wrote to Philip, telling him she had taken the flat, just for you and me. She saw it as a home base for the two of them, place her Greek prince could return to. Philip was at Dartmouth Naval College by then, the early stages of the career that Mountbatten had mapped out for him, and in the summer of 1939 he had met Princess Elizabeth for the first time. 13-year-old girl he had shown around the Naval College grounds at Dartmouth while her parents were occupied elsewhere. Flat in Athens was not somewhere Philip came to, but the letter exists and the phrase exists. It tells you something about what Alice was trying to rebuild in the years between the sanatoriums and the war, trying to build something that could contain her son. The war came. Alice stayed. Germany entered Greece on the 6th of April 1941. Invasion came from three directions simultaneously, from Bulgaria in the east, from Yugoslavia in the north after the German-engineered coup had overthrown the government in Belgrade, from Albania in the west where the Italian army had been fighting an inconclusive winter campaign since October. In days the defensive lines were broken. Within 3 weeks the situation was beyond salvage. The Greek royal family fled. King George II left Crete by flying boat on the 1st of June, heading for Egypt and then eventually London. The government followed. Most of the people with foreign connections, foreign passports, or the financial means to arrange an escape left while the leaving was still possible. Athens on the day the Germans marched through Syntagma Square was a city that had emptied itself of everyone for whom staying meant imprisonment or, worse. Alice did not leave. She had no official position in the Greek royal family. She was the exiled and informally separated wife of a prince who had been living in Monaco since the 1920s and would die there in December 1944 without having made any significant reappearance in her life. She was not the Dowager Queen. She held no title that obligated her to follow any particular flag. She was 66 years old, deaf, living alone in Athens. She decided without apparently any great drama that she was not going anywhere. The practical circumstances were not insignificant. She had nowhere obviously to go. Her brother Louis Mountbatten was fighting the war. Her children were scattered across wartime Europe. 3 of them married into German families and one, Sophie, widowed in 1943 when her second husband, Georg Wilhelm of Hanover, the only one to come out of that period in any uncomplicated position. The flat in Athens was where Alice lived. Work she had been doing for Greek charities was where her purpose lay. The city was full of people who were going to need help. She stayed. Occupation came in phases. Germany, Italy and Bulgaria divided Greece between themselves, with Italy taking the largest share including Athens, Peloponnese and most of the islands. The Germans held Salonika and the strategic points along the northern border. Bulgaria took the western and eastern Macedonian territories it had been coveting for decades and proceeded to treat their new populations with predictable harshness. For the first 2 years of the occupation, Athens was under Italian administration. This was not a pleasant condition. Italian military requisitioned food for their own troops while the city's civilian population began to starve. Winter of 1941 to 1942 was catastrophic. Hundreds of people died of starvation in Athens alone. Red Cross documented the mortality statistics with the thoroughness of an organization that can do nothing about the numbers except count them. Soup kitchens multiplied. Charitable organizations, both established and improvised, tempted to bridge the gap between what the city had and what its people needed to survive. Numbers from that first winter are specific enough to register as something other than statistics. In October 1941, daily food ration in Athens had fallen to approximately 1,000 calories per person, than half what an adult human being requires to maintain body weight and basic function. By November it had fallen further. Distribution system that had supplied Athens was broken. The Germans had requisitioned grain stores in Macedonia and Thessaly before handing the southern zone to the Italians, and the Italians had neither the infrastructure nor the particular motivation to address what the Germans had done. City's normal import routes through Piraeus were disrupted. Food that existed in the countryside did not reliably reach the urban population. People died in the streets, not metaphorically, not as a way of indicating general suffering. They died in the streets of Athens on pavements, doorways, of starvation and of the diseases that accompany severe malnutrition. Children were particularly vulnerable. Elderly died at high rates. The people who survived the first winter tended to be the people who had some additional resource, relation in the country who could provide food, a piece of jewelry that could be sold or exchanged, skill that Italian officers were willing to pay for. The people who had none of these things died in proportion to how complete their lack was. Alice was in the middle of this. She had been doing charitable work since the Balkan Wars, and she had been thinking about organized nursing relief since at least the 1930s. The war gave her purpose in a way that the peacetime years of drifting between Italian towns had not. She helped establish and run a community canteen on Patriarcho Joachim Street. Food was distributed to the hungry of Athens regardless of who they were or what they could pay. She worked with the Swedish Red Cross. She visited hospitals, she organized. The canteen operated on a system that was essentially informal. Alice obtained food through whatever channels were available. Purchases at prices that were rapidly becoming unaffordable for most Athenians. Donations from people who had more than they could use. The occasional intervention of international relief organizations, whose representatives could move through occupied Europe with more freedom than civilian residents. She and a small number of Athenian women who had organized around her managed distribution personally. They kept records. They identified the households in the neighborhood that were most severely affected, made sure that families with children and elderly people who could not come to the canteen received food where they lived. Work was not celebrated. There was no ceremony, no press coverage, no official recognition from any authority. Italian occupation administration had its own preoccupations and was not particularly interested in what a 66-year-old deaf foreign princess was doing with a cooking pot on Patriarcho Joachim Street. Alice was left alone to do what she was doing, which suited her precisely. Accounts of what she did during the Italian occupation come largely from Greek sources and from the memories of people who were children at the time and who remembered the grey-clothed foreign woman distributing food in their neighborhood with the focused attention of someone who had assigned herself a task and had no patience for the things that distracted lesser people from theirs. She was not entirely unprotected. Status as a former princess, even a former princess of an exiled dynasty, created a certain distance between herself and the routine brutalities of occupation life. The Italians, whatever their other qualities, had a particular regard for European royalty and generally avoided creating incidents involving people who were cousins however distant, dynasties they were nominally allied with. Alice moved through occupied Athens with the combination of social standing and personal eccentricity that kept many Europeans alive during the war years. She also moved through it with the particular freedom of a person who has been regarded as unusual for so long that the usual conventions for monitoring unusual people had stopped applying to her. She was deaf, she was elderly, at least elderly presenting, with the focused and somewhat otherworldly manner that her combination of deafness and deep religious preoccupation produced. She was clearly spending her days distributing food to poor people. She was not a plausible threat to the occupying military administration. She was allowed to do what she was doing because the people who could have stopped her had no particular reason to notice her. Philip, time Germany invaded Greece, was a serving officer in the Royal Navy. He had joined in 1939 on Mountbatten's guidance and his own strong inclination. Navy had turned out to be the institution best suited to the specific package of abilities and temperament he had assembled across the preceding years. He had quick mathematical thinking, spatial intelligence, an instinct for the large-scale geometry of ships in water, and a capacity for functioning competently under immediate physical threat that was almost certainly connected to having processed most emotional threat by converting it into something manageable and setting it aside. His first real combat action came in the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941. 3 weeks before Germany invaded Greece, HMS Valiant, on which Philip was serving as a midshipman, participated in the engagement in which the Royal Navy sank 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers in a night action off the southern Peloponnese. Philip operated the ship's searchlight during the engagement, illuminating Italian vessels so that Valiant's guns could target them. He was mentioned in dispatches. He was 19 years old. By the time Alice was hiding the Cohen family in Athens in late 1943, Philip was a first lieutenant on HMS Wallace and then HMS Whelp, serving in convoy escort operations in the North Sea and later in the Pacific. He was the man his Gordonstoun training had been preparing him to be. Technically proficient, authoritative with the men under his command, able to assess a situation quickly and act on the assessment without prolonged deliberation. Qualities that the war required from a naval officer were, by an unhappy accident of childhood, exactly the qualities that his childhood had already required him to develop. Distance between him and Alice during the war years was not only geographic. He was on destroyers in the North Sea when the Germans took over Athens. He was in the Pacific when the Cohen family was waiting for liberation on the 3rd floor of his mother's house. He was in Tokyo Bay witnessing the Japanese surrender when Athens was rebuilding from occupation and civil war. War that was the defining experience of his generation, was the experience that kept him furthest from the woman he would only learn to know properly in the 2 years before she died. The Italian occupation ended in September 1943. Change was brought about by the fact that Italy itself had surrendered to the Allies in that month, produced the entirely predictable German response of occupying their former ally and taking over the administration of the territories Italy controlled. The Germans were not the Italians. The shift in Athens was noticeable within days. Changed most visibly and most catastrophically was the situation of the city's Jewish population. Greece's Jewish community was ancient. Salonika in the north had been home to a major Jewish community for centuries, until the mass expulsion from Spain in 1492, when tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews had settled in the Ottoman territories and built communities, carried Spanish into the 20th century as a living domestic language. Salonika in 1943 had approximately 55,000 Jews. By the middle of 1943, German occupation, virtually all of them had been deported to Auschwitz. Precise mortality figures have been calculated and recalculated by historians, and the calculation always arrives at approximately the same place. Greece's approximately 75,000 Jews at the start of the occupation. Roughly 60,000 were dead by the end of it. Athens had its own Jewish community, smaller than Salonika's but established and integrated into the life of the city. The Gestapo, installed in Athens after the September 1943 takeover, moved against this community with the systematic efficiency they brought to the same operation across every country they occupied. Were compiled, apartments were searched, synagogues were raided. The process in Athens, as everywhere, required that people be found before they could be taken, and finding people required either cooperation from informers or the physical inability of hunted to hide. Some people could hide. Alice was one of the people who could help them hide. She was living by this point in a large house on Mitropolios Street in central Athens. She had been using as both a residence and as the base for her charitable activities. The house was, by the geography of occupied Athens, in a significant location. It was close to the Gestapo headquarters that had been established in the area. Proximity was not accidental on the Gestapo's part, who chose their headquarters according to logistical convenience. It was also, turned out, not entirely accidental on Alice's part, that she was aware of what was happening in the building down the street from her. Cohen family had been known in Athens for a long time. Hymaki Cohen was a Jewish parliamentarian who had served in the Greek parliament and who had in 1913 performed a service of some significance for King George I of Greece. The nature of this service comes down through family and historical accounts. Involved assisting the king at a moment of political difficulty. kind of assistance that Greek parliamentary figures of his era were positioned to offer, and that kings of smaller European states sometimes found themselves needing. Cohen died in 1943 before the worst of the German crackdown on Athens Jews. He left behind a widow named Rachel and 5 children. By the time the Gestapo began its systematic hunt for Athens' Jewish community in the autumn 1943, the situation for Rachel Cohen and her family had become immediately dangerous. 4 of the Cohen sons had already gotten out of Athens through Turkey to Egypt, joining the Greek military forces fighting with the Allies. Rachel, one daughter named Tilde and a son named Michel who had not yet managed to leave were in Athens and exposed. Message reached Alice through intermediaries. The Cohen family was known to Alice through the social networks of pre-war Greek aristocratic and parliamentary life. Rachel's husband had had connections to the royal family through his service to King George I. The connection was not close, it was real. Alice agreed immediately. There is no surviving record of deliberation of consultation with anyone, weighing the risks or calculating the personal cost. The surviving accounts describe someone who was asked and who said yes without apparent hesitation. The third-floor apartment in her house on Metropolios Street was prepared for Rachel and Tilda. Rachel and Tilda moved in. Kel Cohen joined them at some later point in the concealment period. The arrangement was known to 2 trusted intermediaries. A man named Demosthenes Forashins, a woman referred to in the historical record as Simopolou. No one else was told, not Alice's daughters, not Philip, the relief organizations Alice worked with, not the Swedish Red Cross contacts who saw her regularly, not the Greek palace staff, no one. 18 months is a long time to hide people. Most hiding operations collapsed within weeks. Pressure of neighbors who noticed something unusual, from informers motivated by money or fear or resentment, from the simple logistical difficulty of maintaining concealment for more than a few days in a densely populated urban environment where people moved around each other at close quarters. The hiding operations that lasted were the ones where the concealed people were invisible, not just physically, socially, where the patterns of life around them continued in a way that gave external observers nothing anomalous to report. Danger during those 13 months was not theoretical or background. Gestapo headquarters was close enough that Alice could observe people coming and going from it, from certain windows of her house. Deportation operations were ongoing during this period. Athens was a smaller Jewish community than Salonika. The Gestapo was methodical and had lists. Each week of the occupation brought new reports of families who had been found, who had come forward, under the impression that registration would protect them, who had been betrayed by neighbors or acquaintances, who had calculated that information had a price the Gestapo would pay. Alice knew this was happening. She was not isolated from the information moving through the city. She continued her charity work and her hospital visits, and she returned each day to a house that contained people the Gestapo was looking for. Alice achieved the 13 months partly through the structure of the house itself. Third-floor apartment could be accessed without traversing the parts of the building visible to the street. She achieved it partly through her own behavior, which did not change. She continued her charity work, continued to receive the occasional visitor. She continued to exist in the life of occupied Athens, the eccentric elderly foreign princess, who distributed food and visited hospitals and was not worth the Gestapo's time. She was known in the neighborhood. This was crucial. The people who lived within the network of streets immediately surrounding the house on Paulio Street knew Alice by sight, knew her habits, knew her occupation-era routine. She had been present in this neighborhood since her return to Athens in 1938. She had been distributing food through the canteen since the Italian occupation began. Grey-clothed woman with the contained manner and the slightly tilted listening posture of a deaf person trying to follow a conversation was a familiar feature of the neighborhood's visual landscape. Familiar things do not attract the particular quality of attention that unfamiliar ones do. Rachel Cohen was in her early 70s and she was, by the accounts that survived through her son Michel's testimony and the Yad Vashem investigation, a woman of substantial personal resources. Her husband had been a parliamentarian in a political culture that rewarded intelligence, social acuity, and she had been beside him through all of it. She had raised 5 children. She had, before the occupation, part of the Athenian Jewish social world that overlapped at its edges with the Greek parliamentary and aristocratic worlds in which Hymaki had moved. She was not someone who panicked. She was not someone who occupied the third-floor apartment in a state of helpless anxiety. She waited with the determination of a woman who had decided that waiting was the thing she was doing, and who brought to it the focused attention any purposeful activity requires. Tilda was younger, and the confinement bore differently on her. Counts do not detail the texture of Tilda's experience with the same specificity as Rachel's. Can be inferred is that two women living in a single apartment for 13 months in a city under occupation, no access to the outside world, and with the constant awareness that discovery meant deportation, managing a psychological situation that had no good solution and required sustained active management rather than passive endurance. Michelle Cohen's situation during the later part of the hiding period is somewhat less clear from the historical record. He had been in Athens and unable to get out when the Germans arrived, and he made his way to his mother and sister at some point during their concealment. His eventual escape, and the routes available to young Greek Jewish men who were trying to reach the Allied forces in the Middle East, constituted a separate strand of the family's survival story. She visited the Cohens regularly, not furtively, not briefly, not with the constrained interaction of someone doing the minimum necessary to keep a dangerous secret alive. She spent time with them. She talked with Rachel at length. Rachel Cohen was a woman of education and formidable personal dignity, and Alice, who had spent years studying the Greek Orthodox faith and thinking about the relationship between religious practice and practical service, found in Rachel a person whose tradition and whose experience she was genuinely curious about. Conversations covered Jewish history and religious practice. They covered what Rachel's life had been, what her husband had been, what her sons were doing somewhere in the Middle East fighting for a country that was currently being administered by the people trying to kill her. Is something in the specific texture of those conversations that deserves attention. Alice had converted to Greek Orthodoxy in 1928, in her early 40s after a period of intense religious experience that her family had classified as psychotic. Conversion had been real and lasting. It was not the kind of formal orthodoxy that European royalty sometimes adopted for dynastic reasons. Faith she had arrived at through her own experience, and had maintained through everything that followed. She had thought, since at least the 1930s, about what the obligations of that faith looked like in practice. Nursing sisterhood she was planning was one expression of those obligations. The conversations with Rachel Cohen were another. She asked about Jewish observance. She asked about the specific practices that Orthodox and Jewish traditions shared, the ones where they diverged, and the reasoning behind both. She asked about Shabbat. She asked about the prayers Rachel said in the apartment on the Sabbath, in the third-floor room of a house near the Gestapo headquarters. Was not, from Alice's perspective, the behavior of a hostess making conversation to comfort a distressed guest. It was the behavior of someone who was genuinely curious about another tradition's relationship to the same God she was in conversation with herself. Conversations were, among other things, an act of humanity in the most basic sense. The Cohens were not cargo in a hideout. They were people Alice had chosen to shelter, and she treated them as the people they were, in circumstances that had stripped most of the forms of courtesy from daily life and left behind something starker. Afternoon conversations on the third floor of the house on Mitropoleos Street, with the Gestapo headquarters visible from the window, one of the things that held the arrangement together across 13 months. Food was another thing. Alice organized the food supply to the third-floor apartment through the same informal channels she used for the canteen on Patriarchal Joachim Street. The occupation had made food expensive and sometimes unavailable, feeding 3 additional people without accounting for them in any way that would appear on the occupation authorities' records required. Consistent practical problem-solving. The 2 intermediaries, Demosthenes Foris and Simopoulou, were essential to this. They were the people who could move through the city with more freedom than the Cohens and less visibility than Alice, and who handled the specific transactions that the arrangement required. What none of this had was official backing of any kind. There was no network, no organization, of which this particular rescue was one instance among many. Alice was not part of a Greek resistance cell. She was not in communication with a Jewish rescue organization. She was an elderly deaf woman with a house near the Gestapo who had been asked whether she could shelter a family and had said yes, and she managed the practical requirements of that yes with the same applied intelligence brought to every other practical problem she had faced in her life. The Gestapo came. This is not a dramatic embellishment. They came some point during the concealment period because they had received a report or were conducting routine checks or had become curious about the house. The historical record does not preserve the exact date or the specific reason. Preserves is the account of what happened when they arrived and sat down to question Alice. The setting matters as much as the event. House on Mitropoleo Street was in a part of Athens where the German military administration had established a significant presence. Gestapo's Athens office was tasked with several simultaneous operations, identifying and arresting Jews who had not complied with registration orders, monitoring Greek resistance activity, tracking Allied intelligence operations, and maintaining the general surveillance apparatus that occupied administrations require to maintain control. They were busy, they were not omniscient, but they were thorough, and they did conduct periodic checks on households in the areas they considered sensitive. Alice received them in a room. There are 2 officers in the account, though the exact number is uncertain. Certain is that they sat down with Alice with the intention of questioning her. The questioning proceeded according to a pattern they applied everywhere, and that almost everywhere produced results. She did not understand them, she was deaf. She was moreover a European princess of impeccable if complicated lineage who had been living in Athens during the entire occupation, which suggested at minimum that she had no particular reason to hide and had managed not to attract serious official tension over the preceding years. She answered questions with the unhelpful blankness of someone who genuinely could not follow what was being asked. She asked them to speak more clearly. She tilted her head. She asked them to repeat themselves. The interrogation went nowhere, could not go anywhere, because the tool the Gestapo used most reliably in interrogations, which was the pressure of being understood in your hesitations and evasions as well as in your stated denials. No purchase on a woman who was demonstrably and verifiably unable to hear clearly. You cannot pressure someone by the weight of knowing what they know when they can legitimately say they cannot hear your questions. Officers left without having found anything. The Cohens on the 3rd floor were undisturbed. Alice had been deaf her entire life. Deafness had been the first thing she had to adapt around, the first challenge that her intelligence had to solve before she could participate in the world around her. Lip reading had been the solution, and she had learned it in 4 languages. Lip reading required a cooperative speaker and an unobstructed view of the lips. It was entirely possible. Brightly lit room with 2 Gestapo officers who were speaking quickly and not looking directly at her. She had understood every word and was choosing to perform incomprehension. It was equally possible that the combination of German accent, rapid speech, and official paperwork genuinely reduced her comprehension below useful levels. The historical record cannot fully resolve this. Result is unambiguous. What the interrogation also reveals in its outcome is something about the specific intersection of class, nationality, disability that had shaped Alice's life for 60 years and that she had learned to navigate with considerable skill. She was a princess. She was the daughter of a marquis and a princess, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, mother-in-law of the woman who would shortly become Queen of England. The Gestapo officers sitting across from her were hierarchy of the world she had been born into, of considerably lower status, mattered in occupied Europe in ways that it is uncomfortable to acknowledge, because it means that the protection she was able to provide to the Cohen family depended partly on the same machinery of aristocratic privilege that also produced the family dynamics that had sent her to the Berlin Clinic in 1930. Privilege and suffering can occupy the same biography. Alice's life demonstrates this with some precision. After the officers left, Alice went upstairs. Accounts that survive do not describe this moment in detail, but the implication of what Michelle Cohen later told Yad Vashem officials is that Alice let the Cohens know what had happened, probably in terms that conveyed the fact of the visit and its outcome without dramatizing either. The arrangement continued. The 13 months continued. Upstairs, Rachel Cohen waited. Athens was liberated in October 1944. British forces under General Ronald Scobie entered the city on the 14th of October. The Germans withdrew, collaborationist government dissolved, and the city exhaled after 3 years and 7 months of occupation. Liberation was not the arrival of normal life. Athens emerged from occupation as a city in severe crisis. The infrastructure was depleted, economy was in ruins. The political factions that had been suppressed or divided under occupation now confronted each other in the open. Royalist and communist resistance organizations, which had spent the occupation years fighting each other nearly as much as they had fought the Germans moved immediately toward the armed conflict that would become the Greek Civil War. British troops who had come to celebrate liberation found themselves managing a situation that looked more like the beginning of a new conflict than end of an old one. The specific period from the October liberation to the December violence was one of turbulent fragility. 3rd of December 1944, communist demonstrators in Syntagma Square were fired upon by British troops according to some accounts, Greek police according to others. The shooting began a period of open urban combat in Athens that lasted until February 1945. Areas of the city that had just emerged from German occupation were divided again, this time by Greek factions, into zones of control that shifted as the fighting continued. Alice remained in the house on Metropolios Street through this as well. Cohens came out on the 15th of December 1944. The date falls in the middle of the Decembriana, as the December fighting was called. Athens was not yet fully safe, but the specific danger of the Gestapo had passed with the German withdrawal in October. Rachel and Tilde and Michelle Cohen could leave the third-floor apartment and move through the city again. Had been in that apartment since the autumn of 1943. They were alive. The liberation did not resolve Athens' immediate problems. The city that emerged from occupation was politically fractured between royalist and communist factions, who moved almost immediately toward the civil conflict that would last until 1949. The British presence was as much about managing this political crisis as it was about celebrating liberation. Winter of 1944 brought violence between Greek factions, where there had recently been violence from German occupiers. For Rachel Cohen and Tilde and Michelle, the liberation meant they could leave the third-floor apartment. The exact date given in accounts of the rescue is the 15th of December 1944, when the Cohens were able to come out. Rachel Cohen, who was in her 70s by this point, had been living in that apartment since the autumn of 1943. She had survived, Alice told no one. Not when the Cohens left, not in the months immediately following, not in the years that followed. In the 2 years she spent at Buckingham Palace before her death. Philip learned about the rescue not during her lifetime. From the investigation that Yad Vashem conducted decades later, Alice had helped hide a Jewish family from the Gestapo for 13 months in a house 2 minutes from the Gestapo's own headquarters, survived a direct interrogation by those officers, and never mentioned it to anyone. Reason she gave in the one brief comment that has survived that touches on this track almost exactly with what Philip would later say at Yad Vashem on her behalf. She did not appear to think she had done anything that required explanation. A family had needed shelter, and she had had shelter to offer. Arithmetic in Alice's framework resolved clearly and quickly. Everything else, the danger, the sustained concealment, deliberate use of her own disability as operational camouflage, was simply the working out of a conclusion she had reached before the Cohens arrived. The years from 1945 to 1947 were years of rebuilding in a city that had very little to build with. Athens in 1945 was still digesting the combined damage of the occupation and the civil conflict. Civil war proper was underway by 1946 and would continue until 1949. Alice continued her charitable work through all of this, operating in the same network she had used during the occupation, but now in a political environment that required navigating the factions that had placed the occupation administration. She was not idle during this period, and she was not defeated. She had come through 5 years of occupation and urban combat, and had found at the end of it, her capacity for practical service was undiminished. The nursing sisterhood she had been planning since before the war was now taking a definite shape in her thinking. She had models for it that went beyond Grand Duchess Elizabeth's Moscow community. She had observed and participated in relief organizations for 30 years. She knew what worked and what the common organizational failures of such enterprises were, and she had specific thoughts about how the combination of religious observance and practical nursing could be structured to make each element stronger rather than leaving them in competition. She was also, by the end of the war, fully clear about what she had been wearing for years and what it meant. Grey of her dress and coat during the occupation years had moved from a practical choice toward a deliberate one. By 1947, when she arrived at Philip's wedding, the grey was a statement that was moving toward becoming a vocation. Came to Athens in the autumn of 1944 with the British forces aboard HMS Whelp, part of the naval escort protecting British military operations in Greek waters. He saw Alice. He arrived in a city coming apart at the seams. caught between liberation and civil war, and his mother was there in the house on Metropolio Street, exactly where she had been when he had last written to her. She was alive. He was unchanged in any of the ways that would have alarmed him. Did not tell him about the Cohens. He was 23 years old. He had been fighting a war for 4 years. He had been at Normandy in June 1944, present for the landings that would eventually produce the liberation he was now witnessing in Greece. He had watched the Japanese surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay from HMS Welp in September 1945. He had acquired, through the specific education of wartime naval service, a version of the qualities that Gordon Stoon had begun: self-possession under pressure, competence in crisis, the practiced ability to keep functioning when everything around you was failing. He was the man his mother had needed him to become, and she was the woman who had stayed in Athens and survived. And neither of them appears to have had any particular conversation about what either of those things had cost. This is what the Philip of later decades describes, in the rare moments when he was willing to discuss his family at all. His childhood was not something he analyzed. His relationship with Alice was not something he interrogated. He had learned early that the only productive response to circumstances you could not change was to continue and not complain. He had applied this lesson with considerable discipline for as long as anyone could observe him doing it. The discipline was real. It was also, anyone who watched him raise a son through the 1950s and 1960s could see, not entirely without its costs. Philip spent the remainder of November and December 1944 in and around Athens, conditions that were more complex than the word liberation could contain. The Decembriana was beginning. Fighting between Ellis communist forces and the British-backed Greek government forces would intensify through December and into February 1945. HMS Welp was part of the British naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Philip moved in and out of Athens over these weeks as his duties allowed, and he saw Alice more than once during this period. What they talked about, cross those encounters in the house on Metropolio Street, in a city in the middle of a civil war that had not yet been announced as one, is not recorded. They were not a pair who were accustomed to talking about the things that most needed saying. Alice had not told him about the Cohens. Philip had not told her anything about the specific texture of what the 4 years of the war had been. Talked about the practical things, his naval posting, the political situation in Athens, family news that could be passed between a mother and son, in short visits across an occupation and a liberation. He was in Tokyo Bay in September 1945 watching the Japanese surrender from the deck of HMS Welp. Then the worst of the Greek civil conflict had subsided into the negotiated ceasefire of the Varkiza Agreement in February 1945. Civil War's deeper conflict would resume in 1946 and continue until 1949. Alice was in Athens through all of it. She was doing what she had been doing: charitable work, hospital visiting, the slow accumulation of the purpose she was heading toward. Philip came back to England after the war ended and returned to the career he had been building. He was at Corsham, at the Naval College at Greenwich, working his way through the peacetime assignments that a young officer of his evident ability could expect. He was also, by 1946, beginning of the formal relationship with Princess Elizabeth that would lead to the engagement announcement in July 1947 and the wedding in November of that year. The relationship had been developing in correspondence and occasional meetings since at least 1944, and possibly earlier. 13-year-old girl he had shown around Dartmouth in 1939 had become the heir presumptive to the British throne, and a woman to whom Philip was genuinely, not just dynastically attached. Alice knew about the relationship before it was announced. Philip corresponded with her through the years of its development. She was not a figure in the negotiations and the consultations that the engagement required, which involved the palace, the government, Mountbatten, and the various institutional requirements of marrying a British princess to a foreign prince whose closest sisters had married into Nazi Germany. She was Philip's mother living in Athens, receiving letters about the life her son was building in England. She sent letters back. She offered no known opposition to the match. She had been in favor of Elizabeth from the early stages by the accounts that survived. She was invited to the wedding. She came. If you are reading this on a phone or a computer, take a second to subscribe to this channel before we continue. Thousands of people are watching stories like this one every week, and every subscription tells us to keep making them. Hit the subscribe button. We will be here with you for the rest of Alice's story. The nursing sisterhood came into existence in 1948. Alice had been planning it for at least a decade, perhaps longer. The model was explicit and she stated it without embarrassment. Aunt Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, her mother's sister, had established the convent of Saints Martha and Mary in Moscow before the First World War, a religious nursing community that combined orthodox contemplative practice with practical medical work in the surrounding community. Elizabeth had been murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918, thrown alive into a mine shaft near Alapyevsk, along with several members of the Romanov family. She had been canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. Her community in Moscow had been closed and her work had been dismantled. Alice named her sisterhood for the Gospel Sisters, the two women whose different responses to Christ's visit to their house had become one of Christianity's foundational texts about the relationship between contemplative practice and active service. Martha worked, Mary sat at the feet. Tension between the two modes had occupied Christian thinkers for 2,000 years, and Alice, who had converted to Orthodoxy in 1928 and had been thinking about the implications of that conversion through everything that followed, had arrived at the view that the answer was both. The sisterhood would pray and it would nurse, and the two activities would support each other. She wore the grey habit from the moment she founded it. She was 63 years old. She was not technically ever formally professed as a nun. She wore the habit as the head of the sisterhood, as its founder and organizing intelligence. The woman who had decided that this was what she was and had dressed accordingly. The grey dress and veil were not a disguise and not a retreat, were a statement of what she thought she was doing. Philip's wedding had taken place in November 1947, 11 months before the founding of the sisterhood, but Alice was already thinking about it when she sat in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947 in a grey dress and grey hat. The grey was not a habit yet, it would become one. She arrived at her son's wedding in the colour she had been choosing for years, colour that distinguished her from the velvet and ermine and jewelled tiaras of the people around her, and she sat through the service in Westminster Abbey as the mother of the groom who had survived everything necessary to be there. Was one detail about Alice and Philip's wedding that would not become widely known until decades later. Princess Elizabeth was engaged to Philip in July 1947, and when the engagement ring was being designed, some of the diamonds came from a tiara that belonged to Alice. The tiara had been a family piece, part of the assets of the Greek royal connection that Alice had carried with her through the exile years and the sanatorium years and the occupation years. She gave the stones so that her son's future wife could have a ring. Ring was made by Philip Antrobus Limited, and it remains one of the most recognizable pieces of royal jewelry in the world. Diamonds in it came from a woman who had jumped through a window in Kreuzlingen in 1932 and told the staff she was fed up being a princess. She watched Philip and Elizabeth marry, with the diamonds from her own family's jewelry, on the hand of the woman he had chosen. She was seated separately from the other royals. She was not surrounded by people. She was the mother of the groom in grey, alone in a way that the photographs capture even when they cannot quite explain. The sisterhood never had more than a handful of members, not a mass institution. Alice had neither the organizational resources, nor perhaps the administrative temperament to build something large. What she built instead was something specific and real. A small community of women who lived together in Athens, provided nursing care in the surrounding neighborhood, and who organized their daily life around the rhythm of orthodox prayer and practical service that she had been imagining for a decade. The physical base of the sisterhood was a house on Benaki Street in the Kolonaki district of Athens. Alice had acquired it for the purpose, and it served as both convent and clinic, domestic-scale institution that treated the people of the surrounding neighborhood for the variety of conditions that afflicted people in a post-war Greek city operating on a still precarious economy. The nursing work was practical and immediate: wound care, midwifery support, care of the elderly who had no family to tend them, the treatment of children's illnesses that in the 1950s could still claim lives that antibiotics would later save routinely. The women who joined were Greek mostly from religious backgrounds rather than professional nursing backgrounds. Alice trained them as she could and applied the medical knowledge she had accumulated through her Balkan Wars nursing experience and her decades of hospital visiting and charitable work. The combination of prayer and nursing was not a vague aspiration. Sisterhood followed the Orthodox daily office: morning prayers before the nursing day began, evening prayers after it ended, Sabbath and feast days observed according to the church calendar. Alice did not relax these requirements for organizational convenience. She believed, with the consistency of someone who had arrived at a conviction through experience rather than inheritance, prayer and the nursing were both necessary, and that removing either one would damage both. What the sisterhood also provided, for Alice specifically, was a structure that her life had been missing since before the sanatoriums. She had spent most of the years between 1917 and 1948 without a stable institutional home. She had been exiled, committed, transferred between institutions, nomadic in Italy, returned to Athens, survived an occupation. Sisterhood gave her a community and a daily rhythm and a role that was unambiguous. She was the founder and head. Specific responsibilities of that role were ones she could meet through the combination of faith, medical knowledge, organizational intelligence she had developed across 60 years. The practical challenges were considerable and consistent. Money was always short. The Greek Civil War created a context in which charitable institutions operated against a background of periodic violence and extreme material deprivation. The post-war economy was recovering slowly and unevenly. Resources available to a small religious nursing community were limited by all the forces acting on the wider society. Alice sold jewellery to fund it. This was not a one-time gesture. It was a pattern repeated across the years the sisterhood operated. Items from the family collection that she had retained through successive displacements were converted into operational funds. Diamonds from her own tiara had gone to Elizabeth's ring. Other pieces went to fund the running of the sisterhood and the care of the people it served. By the time the sisterhood finally wound down in the mid-1950s, when the last of the sisters had left, and Alice was alone in Athens without the community she had built, she had converted most of what she had inherited into the work she had decided to do. Philip sent money. This is documented. He sent it at various points during the sisterhood's operation, transfers that supplemented Alice's resources and kept the operation going through specific financial crises. The pattern of a son sending money to his mother from a distance, unable or unwilling to be more present but performing care through the available means. One of the threads that runs through Philip's relationship with Alice across the years of their separation. He and Elizabeth visited Athens in 1950 as part of a tour of the Mediterranean. Alice was there and they saw each other. Visit was brief and formal in the way that royal tours require their meetings to be. It was followed by the continuing long-distance relationship of letters and occasional transfers. Philip was by then the husband of a woman who would shortly become queen, and was adjusting his characteristic mixture of determination and visible discomfort to what that meant for his own position. Naval career would end after the death of King George VI in February 1952. The accession of Elizabeth required Philip to abandon active naval service and take up the permanent ceremonial and administrative role that occupy him for the next 50 years. The career he had worked toward and excelled at was over at the age of 30, placed by a role that was defined by being next to someone else rather than by any independent capacity of his own. He managed this transition with the same stoicism he brought to everything that he could not change and had to accommodate. Coronation in June 1953 gave the world one of the most discussed photographs of Alice's later life. She attended the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II and sat in the royal gallery in her grey habit, spare and striking figure among the jewelled and ceremonial dress of the other royal guests. The photographs show her clearly, upright, attentive, wearing no jewels whatsoever, in the grey that by that point had become entirely characteristic. She watched her son process through Westminster Abbey as the consort of the Queen of England, 48 years after she had arrived at Edward VII's coronation as a 19-year-old, and met the man she would marry. Sisterhood wound down gradually through the early 1950s. The sisters who had joined Alice left one by one, for reasons that the record does not fully preserve, but that probably included the combination of financial precarity, demands of religious life in an institution that was entirely dependent on the sustained commitment of its members, particular difficulty of building a lasting community around a founder whose personal authority was not easily separable from the institution existence. When the last sister left, Alice was alone in the house on Benaki Street with the habits and daily rhythms of the sisterhood still structuring her days, but without the community the rhythms had been designed to sustain. She adapted. The adaptations were the characteristic ones. She continued her charitable work. She maintained her religious practice. She visited hospitals and worked with the organizations she had been working with before and during the war. the grey habit remained. Nursing sisterhood as a formal institution was gone, but the vocation it had expressed was not. Athens in the middle 1950s was a city rebuilding from two successive catastrophes. The Civil War had ended in 1949 with a royalist victory. The reconstruction that followed was economic and political simultaneously. Marshall Plan directed resources toward Greece as part of the broader post-war Western European reconstruction. Greek economy grew through the 1950s at rates that were impressive in aggregate and uneven in distribution. The city's population was increasing rapidly as rural Greeks moved to Athens looking for work. Informal settlements and overcrowded neighborhoods that this migration produced were the areas where the kinds of poverty that Alice had spent life addressing were most acute. She was in those areas. The accounts of Alice's Athens years in the late 1950s and the 1960s describe a woman who had become in the city's life a familiar and somewhat eccentric presence. Foreign princess in grey, who had stayed during the occupation, who had founded a nursing sisterhood, who still showed up at hospitals and charitable organizations with the same practical focus she had always had. She smoked. Direct to the point of bluntness, she was not interested in social performance of any kind. She had been through too much for the careful navigation of social expectations to seem like a worthwhile investment of her time. Philip continued to visit when royal business brought him to Greece, and Alice continued to correspond with Elizabeth, with Philip, with Charles, Anne. The letters were the medium of their relationship during these years. Regular, affectionate in the contained way that the family managed affection, informative about the practical details of each other's lives. Alice asked after the children with the grandmother's combination of genuine interest and occasional pointed comment. She expressed opinions about things clearly when she had them. She did not perform the mild deference that elderly relatives sometimes adopt toward people who hold power in the family structure. Charles recalled her visits with the combination of affection and apprehension that characterized his memories of most of the formidable women in his early life. She came to Buckingham Palace or to Clarence House, and she was kind to the children. She was not soft. She was strict in the way that people who have actually disciplined themselves are strict, from the inside out, from a set of standards applied equally to herself, without the indulgence of lowering the bar for young people who were not yet ready to clear it. Charles said, in the biographical accounts that touched on Alice, that they were nervous about being late when she visited. Nervousness was grounded in something real. She did not approve of lateness. She had spent years in institutions where other people controlled her time. She had come out of those institutions with a very clear idea of what it looked like to respect other people's time. Charles was born in November 1948, the year Alice founded her sisterhood. He was the grandchild who grew up with the awareness of who his paternal grandmother was and the distance at which she lived. Early years were shaped by the same forces that shaped most children of the royal household. Parents who were often away, nannies and governesses as the primary daily presences, a formal institutional world that treated warmth as something to be rationed. He had known Alice through visits rather than proximity, and the visits had impressed themselves on his memory as occasions when the usual household order was slightly displaced by the presence of a woman who did not observe the usual household dynamics. She had lived through things that made the usual household dynamics seem like a particular kind of performance. She had very little patience for the performance. She did not perform herself. She dressed in grey. She smoked. She said what she thought. She was interested in Charles in the way that people of strong character are interested in young people who have not yet fully formed. Combination of affection and the frank appraisal of someone who is watching a work in progress and has opinions about the direction. She approved of Anne. This is noted in several accounts. Princess Anne had qualities that were recognizable to Alice: self-possession, certain bluntness, a physical courage combined with directness. The relationship between the grandmother and the granddaughter was warmer than Alice's relationship with the grandchildren generally. This may have been temperamental compatibility, and it may have been that Anne reminded Alice herself at the same age, a girl who did not perform softness, who engaged with the world as it was rather than as she would prefer it to be, who had learned early that competence was a better protection than charm. Philip was, by the 1950s, fully established in the role that the monarchy had required him to take when he gave up his naval career. Role was genuinely difficult in ways that his particular formation made it more difficult. He was a man of obvious ability who had been trained from earliest childhood to convert that ability into practical action. Position of royal consort required him to convert it instead into the performance of presence alongside someone else's practical action. Publicly secondary to Elizabeth in everything that mattered officially. He was the person who walked behind the Queen, who stood to her left in photographs, who was consulted but not decisive in the institutional affairs of the monarchy. He handled this with the outward composure that had been his primary social tool since he was 9 years old, and it cost him something. Cost was distributed, as such costs tend to be, most heavily onto the people closest to him. Philip was not a man who handled powerlessness gracefully in private. He was not a man who could access the kinds of emotional vulnerability that difficult situations often require for processing. He had been managing emotions by converting them into competence since his childhood, and the conversion had been thorough enough that the reverse process was not available to him. The frustrations of the consort role went somewhere, because they had to go somewhere, and they went in the direction of his children. Philip himself rarely spoke about Alice in any extended or analytical way. When he did speak, it was to say something that acknowledged the difficulties of his childhood, without either dramatizing them or excusing the people responsible for. He told Hugo Vickers, who wrote the authorized biography of Alice, that he had simply got on with it. Is either the most unrevealing thing a person can say about a childhood that would have broken most people, or it is a precise and accurate description of the only response that had been available to him. The Greek coup came on the 21st of April 1967. A group of military officers, by Georgios Papadopoulos, seized power in Athens in the early hours of the morning. The King of Greece, Constantine II, initially attempted to resist and then fled into exile. The military junta, which would rule Greece until 1974, installed itself in Athens and began the systematic suppression of political opposition. Alice was 82 years old and living in Athens. She had been there through the Italian occupation and the German occupation and the Civil War and 2 decades of political instability. She was not alarmed in any visible way by the latest upheaval. She had watched enough of them. Philip was alarmed. Coup produced an immediate practical problem. His mother was an elderly woman living alone in a city under military dictatorship, a situation that could become dangerous if her royal connections made her a target or a hostage. Question of whether and how to get her out was discussed between Philip and Elizabeth and their advisors. Alice was resistant to leaving. Is consistent with everything she had done across the previous 30 years. She had stayed in Athens through much worse than a military coup. She had been there when the Germans came. She had watched Athens starve. She had hidden people in her house while the Gestapo questioned her. Coup by Greek army officers was not, from Alice's perspective, necessarily more threatening than any of the other situations she had navigated. She had no great desire to move to England and live at Buckingham Palace as an elderly dependent of the royal establishment. Persuaded eventually, or perhaps the practicalities overcame her resistance, she moved to Buckingham Palace in 1967. 2 years is what she got. She moved to Buckingham Palace in 1967, and she died at Buckingham Palace in December 1969. 2 years represent the longest continuous period she spent in proximity to Philip since he was 9 years old, and she was taken to the clinic in Berlin. The accounts of those 2 years have a quality that makes them difficult to read without a certain weight. Philip was 50 years old in 1967, established in the life he had built around and beside and sometimes against Elizabeth's monarchy. Public figure of considerable complexity and occasional controversy, a man who had learned to need nothing from the people who might fail him and practiced this for 4 decades. Alice was 82 and wearing grey, and sleeping in a bedroom in the palace of the woman her son had married. She was given a suite of rooms in the palace. She arranged them to her satisfaction, which did not require much. She had been living simply for decades and had no accumulation of possessions that required elaborate accommodation. She had her books. She had her religious items, the icons and the prayer materials that structured her day. She had her cigarettes. She smoked at the window in the way of a person who has been told firmly and repeatedly that she should not be doing this and has found the persuasiveness of the argument insufficient. She also had the palace's staff, who encountered her with varying degrees of success. Alice had a particular way with staff that derived from the same combination of directness and genuine interest in people that had characterized her nursing work and her conversations with Rachel Cohen. She asked questions and she meant them. She was not performing aristocratic condescension or performing democratic warmth. She was asking because she wanted to know. People who worked in the palace tended to remember her, because genuine curiosity is rarer than its performance. She attended family meals. She attended chapel. She observed the Sunday church services that the royal family attended. She observed them in the grey habit in a family that dressed for church in the costumes of a constitutional monarchy. Incongruity was noticed and after a time absorbed into the visual vocabulary of the household. Alice in Grey in the Royal Gallery had been a feature of photographs since at least the coronation in 1953. 1967 it was simply what Alice looked like, and the household arranged itself around her as it arranged itself around all the specific requirements. People it housed, they ate together, they talked. Philip visited her regularly, Anne visited her regularly. The grandchildren came and went. Alice smoked, which she had always done and continued to do at Buckingham Palace, over the objections of the medical staff and to the resigned acceptance of her son and daughter-in-law. She had been smoking since at least the 1920s, and she was not about to stop at 82, because a doctor thought it inadvisable. What passed between Philip and Alice in those 2 years is not preserved in detail. Biographers have pieced together impressions from people who observed them together. The impression that emerges consistently is of two people who were finally in the same place, and who found the proximity easier than either of had perhaps expected, and who did not even so speak with any great directness about the things that had most shaped both of them. Philip did not ask her, as far as the record shows, about what had happened in 1930. She did not explain, apparently, beyond the bare minimum of acknowledgement that something had happened, that had separated them, and that this separation had been difficult. Had both spent decades not examining the wound directly, and they were not going to begin in the dining room at Buckingham Palace at the end of life. What they had was the daily rhythm of being in the same building. This is not nothing. After everything that had kept them apart, fact of proximity had its own value that did not depend on the conversations they were or were not having. Philip knew where his mother was. He knew she was 3 floors up and that she was eating, and that she was smoking out the window, and that Anne was visiting her, and that she was watching the palace go about its business with the contained observation of a person who had seen a great deal and had very few illusions left to shed. Alice watched Philip. After a lifetime of knowing him mostly through letters and occasional visits, she could watch him in his natural habitat. Institution he had spent 40 years inside, the monarchy he had chosen and had been chosen by, the house in which his wife was queen. She watched how he moved through the palace, how he managed the specific frustrations of the consort role, how he handled the staff and the visitors and the institutional demands. She had spent 70 years reading rooms she could not fully hear, still doing it. What they had was presence after 37 years of absence, or of a relationship conducted at the great distance that the geography of his career and her institution and her exile and her nursing order had posed. They were finally in the same building. She died on the 5th of December 1969. The cause of death was heart and lung failure. She was 84 years old. The death occurred at Buckingham Palace, in the bedroom that had been prepared for her 2 years earlier. She had been unwell for several weeks, in the way of very elderly people who are moving through the last phase with reasonable composure. End was not sudden or violent. The palace informed the press. The announcement was brief and formal. Princess Alice of Greece and Denmark, mother of the Duke of Edinburgh, had died at Buckingham Palace. Philip was 48 years old. He had known for the last several months that this was coming, in the way that the families of very elderly people know these things, and he had been watching it approach with whatever combination of readiness and unreadiness such knowledge produces. He had spent 2 years in the same building as his mother. He had eaten meals with her. He had watched Anne sit with her. He had accepted the specific and limited form of closeness that was available to two people of their particular formation, in the specific setting of Buckingham Palace in the late 1960s. He had been 9 years old when she left, and 48 when she died. In between was almost everything: the schooling, the war, the naval career, the marriage, the children, the public life, the private cost. She had been present in his life across all of it, and absent from most of it, and they had found in the 2 years they shared a building version of the connection that had been available to them in the time remaining. The funeral was held on the 10th of December 1969, Windsor Castle. She was buried in St. George's Chapel, which is where the English royal family buries its dead. It was the correct burial place in terms of protocol and the immediate requirements of grief. It was the wrong burial place in terms of what Alice had actually requested. The burial at Windsor was not a dishonour. St. George's Chapel is not a dishonourable place. The people buried there include some of the most significant figures in British royal history. Alice had lived out the last years of her life in the institution whose dead are buried there. Choice was practical and was made under the ordinary pressures of organising a funeral in the weeks after an elderly woman dies. Alice had said she wanted Jerusalem. She had said it to Philip and to the people around her in the last years of her life. She had said it because she had converted to Orthodoxy in 1928 and had maintained that faith through everything that followed and had decided, people of deep faith sometimes do, where she wanted to be placed in the ground. The request was known and it was noted and it was not, December 1969, possible to carry out. Alice had said clearly and more than once that she wanted to be buried beside her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, the woman after whose model Alice had tried to build her nursing sisterhood, buried at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Elizabeth had been brought there from Russia in 1921. The Bolsheviks murdered her, and the Red Cross was eventually able to repatriate her remains. She lay in Jerusalem in a church that was architecturally Russian and geographically at the center of the contested map of the Holy Land. Alice had said she wanted to be there. The practicalities of a 1969 burial in Jerusalem, in a city and a region still raw from the 1967 war, were not straightforward. The decision was made to bury her at Windsor for the immediate funeral and to attend to the transfer later, 19 years later. On the 3rd of August 1988, Alice's coffin was transferred from Windsor to Jerusalem, brought to the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, and placed in a crypt beside the remains of Grand Duchess Elizabeth. Philip was there. He had flown to Jerusalem for the reburial, a private ceremony conducted without public announcement or media spectacle. It was Philip's first visit to Israel. He was 67 years old. He had never been to the country his mother's rescue efforts had perhaps partially made possible for a Jewish family's survivors to eventually reach. The reburial was private and was not his first official visit. First official visit, which would become notable for other reasons, was still 6 years away. He stood at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in August 1988, and his mother was laid beside her aunt, as she had asked to be, city that holds more contested holiness per square meter than anywhere else on earth. In a Russian Orthodox church on the slope of a hill that looks down at the Garden of Gethsemane and across at the Dome of the Rock. Alice had been born in the tapestry room at Windsor Castle in 1885. She had made her final journey to the east side of Jerusalem. Her aunt was waiting. The story of the Cohens had still not come out publicly at this point. Alice had been dead for 19 years. Philip was standing at her grave in Jerusalem, and he did not know what she had done in the house on Metropolia Street during the autumn and winter, 1943 and the year that followed. The information was somewhere in Greece, in the memory of Michel Cohen, who was now an old man, and who had been a young man hiding on a third floor with his mother and sister, while the Gestapo worked from a building they see from the window. Michel Cohen went to Yad Vashem in 1992. He was 78 years old. He had been carrying the story for nearly 50 years. He had his own reasons for telling it when he told it, and for not having told it earlier. Those reasons belong to him and to the complexity of surviving something and deciding when and how to speak about it. Told the officials at Yad Vashem what Alice had done. He told them about the third-floor apartment and the 13 months and the Gestapo terror. He told them about Rachel Cohen's conversations with Alice, hours spent talking about Jewish faith and history, and what it meant to be living the way they were living. Yad Vashem investigated. Investigation took approximately a year. The documentation was pieced together from Michel Cohen's testimony, from records that had survived the occupation and its aftermath in Greek archives, from correspondence that could be traced through various channels. Picture that emerged was consistent and was not disputed by any of the sources that could be checked. In 1993, Yad Vashem awarded Princess Alice of Greece the title of Righteous Among the Nations, is the organization's formal designation for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Title has been awarded to approximately 28,000 people across the decades since Yad Vashem was established. Each award follows a documented investigation. Each requires evidence sufficient to establish that the person named took a genuine personal risk in service of the rescue being documented. Alice had been dead for 24 years when she received it. Philip found out when the investigation was underway. The phone call or letter or message that told him that his mother had hidden a Jewish family from the Gestapo, had survived a Gestapo interrogation, had done this for 13 months, and had never mentioned it to anyone. Arrived approximately 50 years after the events it described, there are not many reliable accounts of Philip's immediate response. He was not a man who performed his interior states in front of observers. Biographers who were closest to him during this period describe a man who received information about his mother with a characteristic combination of absorption and control. He was learning things about Alice that she had not told him while she was alive. He was learning them from a foreign government's documentation of an investigation into events that had occurred when he was 22 years old, serving in the Pacific theater of a war he had thought he understood. The 1994 visit to Israel was private and unofficial. Philip arranged it himself, flew to Israel in November 1994, and went to Yad Vashem, where the tree planted in Alice's honor stood in the Avenue of the Righteous. Planted a maple tree himself. He gave a short speech at the ceremony. The speech is the closest Philip came in any documented public setting, saying directly what he felt about what had happened between himself and his mother and what her life had been. He said, "We did not know." He said, "She never mentioned it to anyone." He said, "I suspect it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special." He said, "She was a person with a deep religious faith, and she would have considered it a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow human beings in distress." Every sentence is careful. Every sentence reveals something through its carefulness. We did not know. Not I did not know. We, the family. Accumulated absence of information had been shared across all of them, distributed through the 5 decades since Alice had said nothing about what she had done. Inclusive pronoun does something quiet to the acknowledgement. She never mentioned it to anyone. Philip was not the only one who hadn't known. Nobody had known. Alice's silence was not a personal exclusion of Philip, or a consequence of her relationship with him being too distant for her to trust him with the information. She had not told anyone. The silence was not personal, it was constitutional. Was the expression of a woman for whom the action had been so obvious, so simply required by her faith and her humanity. Annotating it afterward would have felt like explaining why you had stepped aside to let someone through a door. I suspect it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special. Suspect. Careful English of someone who is making a claim they cannot fully verify about the interior state of someone who is no longer available to affirm it. Philip was not given to unverifiable claims about his mother's inner life. The word suspect is the word he chose, which is the word of someone who is working from inference and says so, rather than someone who is performing certainty about a person he perhaps never fully knew. She was a person with a deep religious faith, and she would have considered it a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow human beings in distress. This is the sentence that sits at the center of Philip's account of Alice. He is saying that what she did was not heroism in any conventional sense. He is saying that she did it because she was the person she had become through the decades of conversion and contemplation and nursing and exile and nursing sisterhood and grey habit, and that for the person she had become, the question of whether to hide a family was not a difficult question. It was a natural human reaction. It was what someone with a deep religious faith would do when confronted with fellow human beings in distress. He stood in Jerusalem and said this. He stood at Yad Vashem, at the tree planted in his mother's name. First official visit any British royal had made to Israel. He was 73 years old. His mother had been dead for 25 years. She had first been taken from him when he was 9. The question of what Philip carried from his childhood is one that the people who studied him closely could not fully resolve and that Philip himself never fully addressed. The materials are suggestive rather than definitive. Behavioral patterns are visible. The connection between the patterns and their origin in 1930 is plausible, but not something Philip ever confirmed in terms direct enough to count as evidence. He was a man who was competent in almost every measurable dimension, and who was not easy to with. The people who served under his command respected him as a naval officer, and found him demanding in ways that produced results. People who worked around him at Buckingham Palace respected his intelligence and efficiency, and found him capable of sudden, fierce cruelty towards subordinates who had failed in ways he found avoidable. He was funny, genuinely funny. The observational accuracy that comes from having watched people closely for a long time, without being entirely inside the social world you are observing. He was also capable of saying cutting things to the people he was closest to, including the children he had with Elizabeth, left marks that those children described decades later in biographical accounts that their father was not alive to contest. Philip's relationship with the public was its own separate study in the performance of a particular British masculine archetype that he had partly invented and partly inherited from the naval officer tradition of the mid-20th century. He was direct to the point of bluntness. He expressed opinions that the diplomatic conventions of the consort role recommended he not express. He was photographed at the races, polo matches, at the barbecue at Balmoral, in circumstances that the palace press office found inconveniently informal, and that Philip found perfectly appropriate. He was not interested in the performance of royal gravity. He had seen too much actual weight to find the performed version interesting. Gaffes that accumulated over decades were genuinely connected to something real about his character, was that he thought social conventions were often a form of organized dishonesty and had limited patience for them. Was not entirely admirable. The conventions he dismissed were not uniformly pointless, and some of them protected people. The dismissal came from somewhere real. From a man who had spent his childhood learning that social conventions were the things that had allowed his family to hand him to a series of schools and relatives without anyone explicitly acknowledging what was happening, who had developed a correspondingly low estimation of what polished social performance was actually for. Charles was the most documented case. Relationship between Philip and Charles has been analysed at length by biographers. Charles himself in various interviews, and in the accounts given in the documentary channels devoted to royal family dynamics, by the people who observed them together over the decades. The consistent shape of the picture is of a father who expected his son to perform the same stoic resilience that Philip had been forced to develop through necessity, and who was impatient when Charles did not perform it, who did not appear to have access to the understanding that Charles had been opted by the same circumstances that had formed Philip, and had no particular reason to need the same defensive architecture. There are specific documented exchanges, Philip writing Charles letters that registered critical assessments of his public performances, in tones that made clear the assessments were favourable. Philip at Gordonstown itself, which Charles attended following his father's choice, finding the school's challenges natural and character-building where Charles found them miserable. Philip observing Charles's sensitivity and finding it weak in a way that a man who had converted his own sensitivity into armour could not easily recognize as a different, legitimate response to a different, legitimate set of circumstances. Philip had learned not to need anything from people who might fail him, because the people who should have been there for him had not been there. He had built an interior life that ran on self-sufficiency, and had done this as successfully enough that the absence of the kinds of relational warmth many people require was not for him painful in any immediately visible way. He assumed that Charles should be able to do the same. He was wrong about this in a way that he may or may not have understood by the end of his life. The wrongness produced a father-son relationship that Charles described with consistent sadness, and that Philip described, the extent he described it at all, with the same flat acceptance he brought to everything difficult about his family history. Parallel between Philip and his own father Andrew is uncomfortable but accurate. Andrew of Greece had been absent, physically present during Philip's earliest years and then gone, removed to Monaco in the company of a French countess, and the long, slow ending of a marriage that had not survived exile. Philip was not absent in the same way. He was present. He was at Buckingham Palace. He attended the school events and the family dinners. He was physically there in a way Andrew had never managed. The specific kind of presence that Charles needed, which was the presence of someone who could acknowledge uncertainty and model the acceptance one's own vulnerability without treating it as failure, was the kind of presence that Philip could not access because he had spent 40 years systematically dismantling the infrastructure that would have made it possible. This is the inheritance, not the crown, not the title, not the naval career and the ceremonial commitments. The inheritance is the architecture of a person who learned very young that requiring things from other people was a vulnerability he could not afford, and who then raised children within the same architecture without fully accounting for the fact that the architecture had been built under duress, and that building it deliberately, in peacetime, in a child who had not experienced the duress that had made it necessary, produced something different. Alice had built the same architecture in Alice herself. She had survived the Berlin Clinic and Kreuzlingen and South Tyrol by converting her outrage into something that could function within those constraints, by becoming more precise in her thinking, rather than more dependent on the thinking of others, by turning the necessary self-sufficiency of institutional life into an operating principle rather than a circumstance. She had done this successfully enough to stay in occupied Athens through a world war, to hide the Cohens through 13 months, found a nursing sisterhood, to live alone in Athens for years without the community she had built or the family she had produced, finally to move to Buckingham Palace at 82 and find it easier than expected. She had taught Philip this architecture without intending to, disappearing from his life at the age when he most needed her to be there, and he had used it to survive everything that followed. He had passed it on because it was what he had, and he could not give what he had not received. Alice had been the thing he could not talk about, and in any sustained way, not in any way that went beyond the brief acknowledgments of difficulty and the characteristic formula of having got on it. The biographers who tried to get Philip to discuss his mother, his childhood, the years of separation, port with notable consistency that he was willing to go a certain distance into the subject, and then he stopped. The stopping was not dramatic. Closing, a change of subject, a shift in register toward something more manageable. He had been doing this since at least his early 20s, and it had become so fluent that it looked like simple reticence rather than an active management of something he had decided not to examine. The specific things that never became the subject of documented conversation between Philip, biographers, journalists, and interviewers who approached him over the decades, are instructive. He did not speak about what it had been like to be 9 years old when his mother was taken to Berlin. He did not speak about the specific experience of moving from grandmother to school while his mother was in Switzerland asking to leave and being refused. He did not speak about what he had understood at the time and what he had only understood later. He did not speak about whether he had ever been angry about it, which seems like the most obvious response to what happened, and one that Philip, who was a person of considerable internal resources, must have had in some form at some point in his life. What he said instead, when he said anything at all, was that it had been difficult, and that he had managed it, and that the managing was what he had been required to do. Is not dishonest. It is simply incomplete in a way that tells you more by what it excludes than by what it includes. 19 years between Alice's death in December 1969 and her reburial in Jerusalem in August 1988 constitute a significant portion of Philip's middle and later life. He was 48 when she died and 67 when he stood at her grave in Jerusalem. Intervening years were years in which the British monarchy underwent changes that would have concerned Alice if she had been alive to observe. Divorces of 3 of the 4 children, the growing intrusion of the press into royal private life, specific media coverage of Charles and Diana that would culminate in Diana's death in 1997 and its aftermath. Philip navigated all of this with his characteristic combination of institutional loyalty, occasional public misstep, sustained performance of a role he had not chosen and had not exactly refused. Whether he thought about Alice during these years is a question without documentation. Clear is that Alice's story was not publicly known for most of them. She was not famous as a figure. She was known as Philip's mother, and as the woman who had moved to Buckingham Palace and died there. That was approximately the extent of the public knowledge. The nursing sisterhood, the Cohen rescue, the grey habit, the reburial request. None of this had reached a wide public audience. The Jerusalem speech was perhaps the closest he came to examining it in public. Careful sentences, the inclusive plural, the inference rather than assertion about what was in his mother's mind. Attribution of her courage to her faith, rather than to any personal dramatic quality that would have required him to characterize her as a hero, would in turn have required him to characterize himself as the son of a hero, would have required some acknowledgement of what it had meant to have that particular person taken away from him when he was 9 years old. He said she was a person with a deep religious faith. He said it would have seemed natural to her. Planted a maple tree and left Israel without giving any press interviews, because the visit had been private and unofficial, and he had done what he had come to do, and there was nothing else to add. Is one detail from Philip's 1994 visit to Israel that deserves specific attention. He was the first member of the British royal family to make an official visit to Israel. Diplomatic context of the visit had its own separate significance. British-Israeli relations had been complicated since the Mandate period. and a royal visit carried symbolic weight that extended well beyond the personal occasion of the Yad Vashem ceremony. Philip chose to make this visit, which was both publicly significant and personally private, as the occasion for his acknowledgement of what Alice had done. Personal and the political occupied the same act, as they had occupied the same woman. 25 years after Alice's death, Philip stood in Jerusalem and said what he could say about who she was. It was not everything. It was not nothing. Time Philip gave that speech, he had been married to Elizabeth for 47 years, served as the consort of the Queen of England for 42 years, and had spent a significant portion of his public life being described as difficult, abrasive, tone-deaf, and occasionally embarrassing. The caricature was not entirely without evidence, and it was also not particularly interested in the question of where the behavior came from. People who are systematically removed from their attachment figures before the age of 10 tend to develop particular patterns of managing relationships in adulthood, tend to maintain a competent public surface, while keeping their interior life at a distance from the people they are closest to, tend to find direct emotional engagement difficult, not because they have no emotional life, but because they have learned that expressing needs dangerous. They tend to be better at practical competence than at relational warmth, tend to push people away in proportion to how close those people get, because closeness activates the old learning that closeness ends. Not this excuses the moments when Philip was unkind, it does explain them. Explanation and excuse are different operations. Philip standing in Jerusalem, trying to say something honest about a mother who had been taken from him when he was a child, and had carried a secret from him for 50 years, is not someone who needs his failures excused. He is someone whose failures need to be placed in the context of the life produced them. Philip spent the years after the 1994 Yad Vashem visit returning to his public role at Elizabeth's side, continuing the schedule of engagements that the monarchy required, and that he fulfilled with the compressed energy of a man who converted obligation, performance with considerable skill. He founded the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme in 1956, had by 1994 already spread to dozens of countries, and had given hundreds of thousands of young people the particular kind of challenge-based experience that Gordonstown had given him. The scheme was the most direct expression of his pedagogical conviction that young people benefit from difficulty and that the benefit is real and lasting. It was also, in a way that he probably never articulated directly, a form of giving to other young people something that had been essential to his own survival, and that his mother had not been present to give him. He needed it most. He continued to paint and to write and to ask pointed questions at official engagements that were officially about other things. He remained interested in science and technology in a way that the ceremonial obligations of his role rarely rewarded. He had opinions about architecture and environmental conservation, and the organization of the World Wildlife Fund, of which he was an early president, were more substantive than the usual royal-patron relationship, and that produced real institutional consequences. He was any measure other than the one that measured him against the expectation that a royal consort should be invisible and agreeable, person of considerable capability and genuine achievement. He also continued to be a person who had been 9 years old when his mother was taken away and who had never fully processed what that had done to him. These two things coexisted in the same biography. They coexist in most biographies. You look closely enough. The specific content changes, but the structure is common. Person who did remarkable things carried at the same time the unexamined cost of the circumstances that formed them. He died on the 9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle, 6 weeks before his 100th birthday. He had outlived his mother by 52 years. He had been present at her reburial in Jerusalem in 1988 and at the Yad Vashem ceremony in 1994. He had spent the last several years of his life in increasing retirement from public duties. Counts of those final years describe a man who had found a measure of peace in the structured diminishment of what he was required to do. He was at Balmoral, he was at Sandringham, he was at Windsor, he was in the places he had known for 70 years, doing less than he had done, doing it with the deliberate attention of a person who had noticed that there was now less time for inattention. He found peace about his mother is a question that no one can answer. He never provided the answer himself. There's one more piece of this story that belongs in the record, even if it belongs somewhat separately from the main sequence. In 2010, British government named Alice a hero of the Holocaust. This was a formal governmental designation, separate from the Yad Vashem Award and reflecting the British state's own accounting of people who had taken significant personal risks to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Alice was one of the first to be so named in a program that was still relatively new. Ceremony was held at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Philip attended. He was 89 years old. He stood at the ceremony and accepted the posthumous recognition of what his mother had done and said brief words available to him at a public ceremony, something in the same register he had used at Yad Vashem, careful, honest within its limits, acknowledging without dramatizing. In 2021, the President of Israel announced the establishment of a nursing scholarship at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem in Alice's name. The scholarship was to support nursing students, connecting the practical work of the nursing sisterhood Alice had founded in Athens in 1948 to the contemporary education of the people who would continue that work. The announcement came after Philip's death. The arc from the tapestry room at Windsor Castle to the nursing scholarship at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is longer than most arcs. It runs from 1885 to 2021 through the courts of 4 European monarchies, 2 world wars and a Greek civil war, and a German occupation and a sanatorium in Switzerland, and a Gestapo interrogation and a nursing sisterhood and a grey habit and a ceremony at Yad Vashem and a crypt on the Mount of Olives. Alice was in most of those places for reasons she had not chosen and made decisions in them that she did not always have the freedom to make anyway. The decision she made most freely, the one over which she had the most unambiguous control, the decision to offer the 3rd floor of her house to Rachel Cohen and Tilde Cohen in the autumn of 1943. She had been controlled and confined and treated and diagnosed and transferred and released and abandoned and exiled for 20 years before that decision, and she made it as if none of those 20 years had eroded the fundamental sense that a person in distress required a natural human response. This is what the grey habit meant finally. Not resignation, not retreat, not the performance of sanctity. It meant the clarity that comes from having been taken apart by circumstances and having decided, without drama, you were going to do with what was left. If this story has meant something to you, this is the moment to subscribe. Every story we make at this channel takes weeks of research, and the people who subscribe are the reason we can keep making them. If you are watching on YouTube, the subscribe button is just below this video. If you are listening somewhere else, leave a review and tell one person about us. It genuinely helps. The grave on the Mount of Olives is not heavily visited. It is accessible but not prominently marked in the tourist guides to Jerusalem, and the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, beautiful and architecturally striking, is not on the main circuit of sites that international visitors to Jerusalem tend to prioritize. You can stand at the window of the church and down toward the Garden of Gethsemane. The olive trees are so old, they may have been standing in the time of Christ. The ground is layered with the devotion of 2,000 years of pilgrims who came and found something and came back and told others. Church itself was built by Tsar Alexander III in memory of his mother Empress Maria Alexandrovna. Construction began in 1885, year Alice was born at Windsor, and the church was completed in 1888. It is the kind of historical coincidence that means nothing but that the biographical impulse wants to make mean something. Church Alice asked to be buried in was built in the same year Alice was born. Completed in the year before the world that would form her began its final decade of stability before the wars started. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, Alice's great-aunt and the woman whose model inspired the Christian sisterhood of Martha and Mary, came to this church in 1921, 12 years after her murder in the Ural Mountains. Her remains were brought out of Soviet Russia through a chain of circumstances involving the Russian Orthodox mission in Jerusalem and the diplomatic channels available to a church organization during the early Soviet period. She was placed in the crypt. She has been there since. Alice lies beside her. The specific request to be buried at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene says something about Alice's theological geography. The place toward which she oriented herself was neither England nor Greece but Jerusalem, which is the place that both the Eastern Orthodox tradition and the Western Christian traditions identify as the location of the most significant events in human history. Alice had converted to Orthodoxy in 1928 and had maintained that conversion through everything the following decades had required. The conversion was not a public act and was not a social performance. It was what she believed and how she organized her understanding of what she was supposed to do with the life she had. When she said she wanted to be in Jerusalem, She was saying she wanted to end where her tradition told her the most important things had happened. Alice asked to be there because her aunt was there. She asked to be there because the Orthodox tradition she had converted to in 1928 connected her to a network of holy places and holy dead that culminated in her understanding in Jerusalem. She asked to be there because after a life that had been shaped by Windsor and Darmstadt, and Paris and Corfu and Berlin, and Kreuzlingen and Athens, Monte Carlo and London, she had decided that the place she wanted to end was the place her tradition pointed toward when it pointed toward the east. Philip brought her there. He had been with her when she died at Buckingham Palace in December 1969. He had been at Windsor for the funeral in December 1969. He had not been able to bring her to Jerusalem immediately, for reasons that had to do with the political situation in Israel and the Middle East in the years following the 1967 war. He waited 19 years. In August 1988 he flew to Jerusalem and stood at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, and his mother was laid beside Grand Duchess Elizabeth, and he was there, which was the least he could do, and perhaps also the most that was available to him. 2 trees at Yad Vashem stand in the Avenue of the Righteous, which is a long path with trees planted on both sides, each tree representing a person who was investigated and confirmed and named. The avenue requires a walk. It is not possible to take it in quickly. You move through it at the pace of the people beside you, reading the names on the plaques at the base of each tree, understanding progressively what the scale of the accounting means, that there are this many trees because there were this many situations that required people to make the calculation that Alice made in the autumn of 1943. Most of the people who faced that calculation made a different one. Righteous among the nations designation is not given to people for having good intentions, given for documented action at demonstrated personal risk. The investigation that produced Alice's award established that she had taken a real, specific risk, that the risk had been tested by the Gestapo interrogation, and that the risk had continued for 13 months. Award does not make that risk retrospectively safe. It acknowledges it after the fact, in the name of the people who survived because of it. Michel Cohen was 78 years old when he walked into the Yad Vashem offices in 1992 and told them what Alice had done. He had been 29 years old in 1943 when his mother and sister needed a place to hide. He was an old man when he decided that the time had come to tell the story. Reasons he had for waiting as long as he had are not fully preserved in the record. What is preserved is the testimony he gave. 3rd floor apartment, the 13 months, Alice's visits, Rachel's conversations, Gestapo officers who came and left without finding anything. The testimony was detailed enough and consistent enough with the other evidence that survived in archives and correspondence to constitute a documented case. Rachel Cohen had died before the Yad Vashem investigation. Tilda Cohen had died. Of the 3 people who had lived on the 3rd floor of the house on Metropolio Street during those 13 months, only Michel survived to tell the story. He was the witness. He carried the information for half a century because he had decided, for reasons of his own that no one else can fully evaluate, that he would carry it, and that he would give it to the people who would know what to do it when the time was right. Philip found out when the investigation was underway. Phone call or letter or message that told him that his mother had hidden a Jewish family from the Gestapo, had survived a Gestapo interrogation, done this for 13 months, and had never mentioned it to anyone, arrived approximately 50 years after the events it described. There are not many reliable accounts of Philip's immediate response. He was not a man who performed his interior states in front of observers. Biographers who were closest to him during this period describe a man who received information about his mother with a characteristic combination of absorption and control. He was learning things about Alice that she had not told him while she was alive. He was learning them from a foreign government's documentation of an investigation into events that had occurred when he was 22 years old and serving in the Pacific theater of a war he had thought he understood. The 1994 visit to Israel was private and unofficial. Philip arranged it himself. He flew to Israel in November 1994 and went to Yad Vashem, where the tree planted in Alice's honor stood in the Avenue of the Righteous. Planted a maple tree himself. He gave a short speech at the ceremony. The speech is the closest Philip came, in any documented public setting, saying directly what he felt about what had happened between himself and his mother and what her life had been. He said, "We did not know." He said, "She never mentioned it to anyone." He said, "I suspect it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special." He said, She was a person with a deep religious faith, and she would have considered it a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow human beings in distress. Every sentence is careful. Every sentence reveals something through its carefulness. We did not know. No, I did not know. We, the family. Cumulated absence of information had been shared across all of them, distributed through the 5 decades since Alice had said nothing about what she had done. Inclusive pronoun does something quiet to the acknowledgement. She never mentioned it to anyone. Philip was not the only one who hadn't known. Nobody had known. Alice's silence was not a personal exclusion of Philip or a consequence of her relationship with him being too distant for her to trust him with the information. She had not told anyone. The silence was not personal, it was constitutional. It was the expression of a woman for whom the action had been so obvious, so simply required by her faith and her humanity. Annotating it afterward would have felt like explaining why you had stepped aside to let someone through a door. I suspect it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special. Suspect. Careful English of someone who is making a claim they cannot fully verify about the interior state of someone who is no longer available to confirm it. Philip was not given to unverifiable claims about his mother's inner life. The word suspect is the word he chose, which is the word of someone who is working from inference, and says so, rather than someone who is performing certainty about a person he perhaps never fully knew. She was a person with a deep religious faith, and she would have considered it a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow human beings in distress. This is the sentence that sits at the center of Philip's account of Alice. He is saying that what she did was not heroism in any conventional sense. He is saying that she did it because she was the person she had become through the decades of conversion and contemplation and nursing and exile and nursing sisterhood and grey habit, and that for the person she had become, the question of whether to hide a family was not a difficult question. It was a natural human reaction. It was what someone with a deep religious faith would do when confronted with fellow human beings in distress. He stood in Jerusalem and said this. He stood at Yad Vashem, at the tree planted in his mother's name. First official visit any British royal had made to Israel. He was 73 years old. His mother had been dead for 25 years. It had first been taken from him when he was 9. The 2 trees stand together at Yad Vashem, one for Alice, one planted by her son, is perhaps the most direct expression available in the physical world of what their relationship had been and what it had finally become. She had done something extraordinary and had not told him. He had found out after her death and had come to Jerusalem to stand where she had been honored, and he had planted a tree beside hers, and there was nothing more that needed to be said or could be said. She had never been able to tell him why she was taken away. He had never been able to tell her what it had done to him. Had spent 2 years at Buckingham Palace, and found it easier to be in the same place than they had perhaps feared. She had died in that place, and he had buried her in it, and 19 years later had moved her to where she had asked to be. He had stood there in 1988 and not yet known what she had done. He had stood there again in 1994, and he knew, and he planted a tree. Tree has been growing every year since. Before this video ends, if you want to know more about the people around Philip and Alice, the family that shaped them, and the dynasty they were both, in their different ways, trying to maintain, this channel has covered many of them. Queen Mother, who had a complicated and sometimes hostile relationship with Philip that began almost from his arrival at court, is in a video that many people watching this one will find connects directly to the story you have just heard. Princess Andrew of Greece is not a name that comes up in most histories of the British royal family, but it should. The fact that it does not is part of what this video has been about. Thank you for watching. Woman who was born deaf in a room at Windsor Castle in 1885 had a life that moved through everything the 20th century did to the European world it had inherited. She moved through it in the way that particular people do, which is to say with their own specific combination of vulnerability and stubbornness and faith and ordinary human decency, without being entirely destroyed by what was done to them and without losing entirely the thread of what they had decided to be. The specific texture of Alice's life resists the narrative forms that biographies of royal women usually take. She was not primarily a romantic figure or a fashion figure or a diplomatic figure. She was not particularly interested in the public performance of the attributes that royal women of her era were expected to display. She was interested in the poor of Athens, and in the specific people who needed nursing care, and in the relationship between orthodox theology and the practical obligations it created, and in the conversation she could have with Rachel Cohen on a third floor in occupied Athens about Jewish faith, history, and the nature of obligation. She was also, for 20 years of her life between her 40s and early 60s, woman who had been taken from her family and held against her will in a series of institutions on the authority of physicians who applied frameworks to her experience that she rejected, with the logical clarity of someone whose thinking had not been impaired by whatever had been happening to her. The official diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia applied to a woman who lip-read 4 languages, organized field hospitals, charitable canteen under occupation, and hid Jews from the Gestapo represent one of the more vivid examples of the history of psychiatry's relationship with women of inconvenient beliefs and insufficient deference. She was a princess and a patient and an exile and a charity worker and a nursing sister and a mother and a widow and a woman who sat for hours with Rachel Cohen on the third floor of a house near the Gestapo headquarters in occupied Athens and asked questions about Jewish faith and history with curiosity of someone who was genuinely interested. She was also the woman who converted to Greek Orthodoxy at 43 while her family stood in varying combinations of bewilderment and concern, and who maintained that conversion through everything that followed, with a consistency that made it clear she had not converted as an expression of instability, but as the final form of something she had been working toward for years. Visions she had reported in the late 1920s, the ones that had been interpreted as psychotic symptoms by the physicians who examined her, were interpreted by Alice herself as religious experiences of the kind that the tradition she was converting to had extensive frameworks for understanding. Whether she was right about their nature is a question that psychiatry and theology have approached differently in every decade since. No clear resolution in sight. She was named righteous among the nations for what she did with those 13 months. Came to Jerusalem to acknowledge it. The trees grow in the Jerusalem summer. She left Windsor in 1885 and arrived in Jerusalem in 1988. Distance between those two places is not only geographic. The grave is on the Mount of Olives. The maple tree is at Yad Vashem. Diamond ring is in the collection at Buckingham Palace, still worn on state occasions, from the stones of a tiara belonging to the woman who hid Jews from the Gestapo and never mentioned it. There is a useful and slightly uncomfortable way to think about Alice's story, which is to consider what it would have looked like to the people who were making decisions about her in 1930, and to ask whether, given the information they had and the frameworks they were using, they were doing something unreasonable. Answer is that they were not unreasonable by the standards of their time, which is a sentence that is not supposed to make you feel better, but is supposed to make you think about how things come to be standard. Alice's mother Victoria genuinely believed, based on her observations of her daughter's behavior over the preceding years and the assessments of physicians she had reason to trust, that her daughter needed medical care. Binswanger genuinely believed that the institutional setting he ran was providing that care. Freud genuinely believed that the endocrinological treatment he recommended was scientifically grounded. None of these people were monsters. They were people operating within the frameworks available to them, frameworks that had been constructed by people who were mostly not deranged and who had found that the frameworks produced results that were sometimes useful, and who had not always noticed the cases where the frameworks were applied to people who were not sick, and whose containment served the interests of people around them rather than of the person being contained. Alice was the woman who was contained. She was contained because she had inconvenient religious experiences, and because the people around her had more institutional authority than she did, and were using it mostly out of what they understood as genuine concern, to manage a situation they found distressing. She spent 2 years asking to leave Kreuzlingen and being refused. She attempted to escape through a window, told the staff she was fed up being a princess. She had been born at the center of European royal power in 1885. By 1932, she was jumping out of windows in Switzerland, telling people that being a princess was too much. Distance between these 2 points is the 20th century. She lived in both of them. People who were most responsible for Alice's confinement were also the people who meant her the most good. Victoria was a devoted mother. Physicians were dedicated professionals. Andrew had, by the late 1920s, treated into the depression and disengagement of a man who had been through too much. His failure to intervene more forcefully in Alice's treatment came from the same combination of helplessness and self-protection that characterizes many people in many impossible situations. He was not indifferent to Alice. He was exhausted and overwhelmed, and had never been equipped by his own particular upbringing in a family that handled difficulty by not handling it, to engage constructively with the scale of what was happening. What this meant for Philip was that the person who should have intervened to bring his mother home, who should have said to the physicians and to his mother-in-law that Alice was well and that her beliefs were her own, and that she was required to perform normal by the standards of a family that had been expelled from its country, chose not to intervene or could not intervene. Philip watched this happen from the distance of a child at a boarding school who had been told, in the oblique way that adults communicate impossible things to children, his mother was ill and being looked after, and that he should get on with things. He got on with things. He got on with things for the rest of his life. The getting on produced remarkable results, and the getting on cost him access to the parts of his interior life that required not getting on, and both of these things are true. Alice in the sanatoriums also got on with things. She continued to read, she continued to pray, she continued to write letters, she continued to plan the nursing sisterhood. She continued to be the person she was, with the specific modification that the person she was now was a person who was being held against her will, who had decided, after the unsuccessful escape attempt and the conversation with Binswanger about needing her mother's permission to leave, the most productive response to this situation was to continue being the person she was until they let her out. They let her out in 1932. 47 years old. She had been hospitalized since she was 45. Philip was 11. He had not seen her in 2 years. He would not live with her again. The family that had been disrupted by politics and exile and diagnosis had been disrupted by those things past the point of recovery into a different form. A network of places and correspondences and occasional meetings across which Philip moved for the rest of childhood, becoming by the time he reached adulthood someone who did not need what he had not had and who had found ways to live very well on things he had been given instead. Andrew died in Monte Carlo on the 3rd of December 1944. He had been living there since the early 1930s, in the apartment that the French countess, who had become his companion, had helped establish. He died of heart failure. He was 62 years old. Philip was 23 and serving in the Pacific. He did not learn of his father's death until afterward. Andrew left behind very little. The apartment, some clothes, 4 daughters in Germany, 1 son in the Pacific, and a wife in Athens who had not been a wife in any functional sense for more than 15 years. The estate was described in the accounts that have survived as modest to the point of poverty. He had spent the last decade of his life without any significant means or position, entirely dependent on the generosity of his companion and whatever small arrangements could be made for a former prince of exiled royalty. Alice received the news in Athens, sometime in December 1944, in the middle of the Decemvriana. She was looking after her soup kitchens and her charitable arrangements in a city that was fighting a civil war. She had not seen Andrew in years. She had not been his wife in any practical sense for longer than that. She received the information, and she continued doing what she was doing, because there was nothing else she was going to do. The marriage had lasted in its working form for perhaps 15 years, from 1903 to the exile and the gradual separation of the late 1910s and early 1920s, produced 5 children, and a shared experience of a country that had treated them both with the particular cruelty of a political system, using people it had power over as the expression of its own contradictions. Neither Alice nor Andrew had been equipped for the specific difficulties of the life they had been living, and they had managed those difficulties in ways that harmed each other and their children. Then they had separated, and Andrew had gone to Monte Carlo, and Alice had gone to institutions, and eventually to Grey, and neither of them had come to the other for any of the things that marriage is supposed to provide. She outlived him by 25 years. She spent those years in Grey. Grey habit, which Alice adopted formally with the founding of the Christian Sisterhood in 1948, was not a new colour in her life. She had been choosing grey since at least the mid-1940s. The photographs from Athens during the occupation period show her already in clothes of somber colour and plain cut. The grey of the habit was the formalization of an approach she had been developing for years. Decision to dress as what she was, rather than as what the occasion expected of her. What the occasion had expected of her. Across most of her life was the specific costume of European royalty, the tiara and the formal gown at state events. the smart dress at charitable functions, the well-appointed matron's clothing of a woman of her class and generation at the kind of social events people of her class and generation attended. She had worn these things when required. She had not found them to be what she was. What she was. 1948 was a woman who had converted to Greek Orthodoxy, who had founded a nursing sisterhood, survived an occupation and an asylum and an exile, who had sent the diamonds from her family tiara to her son for his fiancée's engagement ring, and who dressed in grey because grey was the colour of someone who had decided what mattered and was not interested in wearing anything else. She arrived at Westminster Abbey in November 1947 in grey. The other people in the Abbey were wearing the things that people wear to royal weddings. She was wearing what she was. The two things occupied the same space without contradiction, because Alice had long since stopped being confused about the relationship between costumes and people. The coronation in June 1953, where she sat in the royal gallery in the grey habit while the people around her wore the full ceremonial dress of a constitutional monarchy. At its visible produced photographs that have been used ever since to illustrate Alice's difference from the institution her son had married into. Difference was real and was not accidental. She was in Westminster Abbey for her son's sake, and she was dressed as herself, was the only dress she had. Alice spent the decade of the 1960s mostly in Athens. The sisterhood had wound down. She was in her mid-70s and then her late 70s, and the physical requirements of active nursing work were not what they had been when she spent nights in the field hospitals in Macedonia 50 years earlier. She continued her charitable work in the ways available to her, visiting hospitals, supporting the organizations she had worked with during the occupation and the Civil War, maintaining the connections she had built across decades of charitable activity in the city. She was well known in Athens in a way that did not translate easily into international recognition. People who knew her were the people of the charitable organizations and the hospital and the Orthodox churches of Athens, people who had been children during the occupation, and who remembered the grey-clothed woman distributing food in their neighborhood. Was not famous in the sense of having a press profile or a biographer. She was known in the way that people who do consistent useful work in a city over a long time come to be known. Presence was familiar, and her work was respected, and the stories about her were the stories of people who had been helped by her, rather than the stories of what she wore or whom she knew. Philip visited when he could. He was not in Athens often. Official engagements of his life took him elsewhere, to the Commonwealth countries that Elizabeth's monarchy was managing its relationships with, to the environmental organizations Philip was increasingly involved with, the official visits and the ceremonies and the dinners that constituted the publicly visible substance of the consort role. His visits to Alice were the private visits of a son to a mother who lived in another country, public visits of a royal figure to a royal relative. They did not make the news. They did not require press management. Were simply the visits of a man to his elderly mother in Athens, with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between them since 1:30 present in the room but not apparently fully addressed in either direction. Alice smoked. Philip accepted this. She was his mother, and she had been smoking for 40 years and she was not going to stop because she was old, and the relationship between a son who had been managing himself since the age of 9 and a mother who had been managing herself since the same period produced by the 1960s a kind of mutual respect that did not require or attempt the reconfiguration of either person's habits or fences. She was 82 when the coup came, and she moved to Buckingham Palace, and she had 2 more years. 2 years were the last chapter of a life that had started in the tapestry room at Windsor Castle and was going to end in another room at another royal palace, but in between had passed through places and experiences that the tapestry room of 1885 was entirely unequipped to predict. 2 years in the palace were, in one sense, too little and too late. They were also, in the specific terms of what was available, exactly what there was. Philip had been building his life at a distance from his mother for 40 years. Alice had been building hers at a distance from everything she had been born into for most of the same period. Found each other in the same building at the end, in a relationship conducted at the particular temperature that two deeply reserved people in 60s and 80s manage when they have arrived at something like peace with the terms that life has given them. Struck the people who observed Alice at Buckingham Palace this final years was the consistency of her manner. She had arrived as a distinguished, elderly woman in extraordinary circumstances, and she remained exactly that, without the adaptation that Buckingham Palace sometimes required of the people who lived there. She observed its rhythms without surrendering her own, present at its functions, without becoming part of its machinery. She was Alice in the palace in the way she had been Alice in the sanatorium, and Alice in Athens, and Alice at the Darmstadt funeral, entirely herself, concentration that a lifetime of self-possession produces in people who have had no alternative. She died as she had lived, without drama and without complaint. The heart and lungs that had worked through Balkan wars and a great war and an occupation and 2 years in a Swiss sanatorium and field hospitals and cold showers and institutional rations and occupied Athens and decades of charitable work finally, 5th of December 1969 were finished. She was 84. She had been a princess for 84 years and a nun for 21 of them, and righteous among the nations for every year since 1943, though nobody knew that last one yet. Alice was born into the greatest concentration of European royal power the world had ever seen. She spent most of her life at the edges of that world. The edges suited her. She was, from the beginning, someone the centre could not entirely accommodate. Too deaf for the social expectations of the drawing room, too religious for the secular pragmatism of the dynastic institution, too direct for the elaborate management of appearances that royal life required, too focused on the work of nursing and feeding and sheltering, to spend much energy on the forms that surrounded it. The extraordinary thing about Alice's life is not the dramatic events in it, though the dramatic events are extraordinary. Extraordinary thing is the consistency of what she chose to do with each situation she was placed in. Balkan Wars she organized field hospitals. In occupied Athens she distributed food. Deepest darkness of the occupation, she sheltered the people being hunted. In the nursing sisterhood, she built a community of care from the religious conviction she had maintained through everything. 2 years at Buckingham Palace, she was present for her son in the specific way that was available to her. In each situation, across 84 years, she found the most useful thing available to her and did it. It is not a remarkable observation about a person's character, if that character had an easy life. It is a remarkable observation about a person who was institutionalized against her will. Children grew up and married and had grandchildren without her, who spent years in Italy and Athens with no family and no community around her, who watched the world she had been born into dissolve in the 2 world wars, who survived an occupation and a civil war and a military coup. Consistency across all of that is not something that lives easily within the narrative categories that are usually applied to royal women. She was not a victim. She was not a hero in the conventional sense, though the Yad Vashem designation and the British government's recognition affirm that she was a hero in a specific and documented sense. She was a woman with a particular set of qualities who was placed in a series of situations that required those qualities, and who met the requirement each time, without being thanked for it, without being recognized for it while she was alive, and without apparently expecting to be. Tapestry room at Windsor Castle was where Alice began. The crypt on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem is where she finished. Between those 2 points she covered 8 decades of the most eventful century in European history, and she covered them in grey. Grey was not the colour of defeat. It was the colour of someone who had decided what mattered and dressed accordingly. Philip died in April 2021. He had outlived her by 52 years. In those 52 years he had been the consort of the Queen of England, founder of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, a naval officer turned ceremonial figure, a father and grandfather and great-grandfather, man who was sometimes admired and sometimes mocked and rarely fully understood. He had stood at Yad Vashem in 1994 and planted a tree and said what he could say. He had been at Windsor and Sandringham and Balmoral and Buckingham Palace, in the places the monarchy required him to be. His mother was in Jerusalem, church on the slope of the hill that looks down at the Garden of Gethsemane. Maple trees in the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem were growing in the Jerusalem summer, providing shade over the path where the names of the righteous are inscribed. Diamonds from Alice's tiara are in a ring that was made in 1947 and has been worn since. Nursing scholarship at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was announced in 2021, the year Philip died, will fund nursing students in the city where Alice chose to be buried. She was born deaf in 1885 and she learned to hear the world by reading its surfaces, and she read, in the autumn of 1943, what was required of her. She did it, and she said nothing about it, and she was in grey for the rest of her life. The story is not finished. The trees keep growing. Note on sources. The primary biographical account of Alice's life is Hugo Vickers's biography Alice, Princess Andrew of Greece, published in 2000, drew on the Binswanger archive in Kreuzlingen, correspondence held in various royal archives, and interviews with people who knew Alice. Yad Vashem investigation files, which formed the basis for the 1993 Righteous Among the Nations designation, separately documented and were drawn upon by journalists and historians who reported on the 1994 Philip visit to Israel. Account of Philip's Yad Vashem speech has been preserved in several forms. Greek sources covering the occupation years, including accounts of the canteen on Patriarchal Joachim Street, supplement the English-language biographical tradition. Binswanger archive is one of the more unusual sources in this story. Ludwig Binswanger was a compulsive record keeper. Kreuzlingen sanatorium's files from the period of Alice's confinement preserve a clinical account of her behavior, her stated beliefs, and her requests for release that is more detailed than most comparable documents from that era. Reading the Binswanger records is reading the gap between what Alice was doing and saying and what the clinical framework of 1930 was able to do with. She said she was sane, she said she wanted to leave, she said her religious experiences were genuine. Notes record these statements and proceed to the next observation about her condition, as if the content of what she said were merely evidence about her state, rather than information about what was actually happening to her. Gap between what Alice said and what the institutional framework heard is one of the defining ironies of her story. Connects directly to the Gestapo interrogation 13 years later, in which the gap between what she understood and what she performed understanding had the opposite effect. She survived, and the Cohen survived, because the institution that was interrogating her could not bridge the gap between what she was doing and what its own framework allowed it to see. She had been trained over 60 years of life in rooms where information arrived imperfectly to work with the gap. The gap was her operating medium. Gestapo, the institution that had developed more sophisticated methods for closing gaps than any organization in the 20th century, found that the specific gap Alice had been managing her entire life was one they could not close. Deaf, and she was a princess, and she was not going to give them anything. Trees at Yad Vashem are in a city that is contested and holy, and has been contested and holy for longer than most of the histories that contributed to Alice's story. They grow without regard for the constation. They provide shade in a summer that is considerable. Planted his tree in 1994, and it has been growing for 30 years. The grave is on the Mount of Olives. The ring is at Buckingham Palace. Story is here. One more thing about the orange crate. Philip was carried off HMS Calypso in a makeshift cot, improvised from a fruit box when he evacuated from Greece as an infant. The story has been told in every biography of Philip and in every account of Alice's life, because it is the kind of image that compresses a great deal of meaning into a small container. The prince in the fruit crate, beginning of a life defined by impermanence and improvisation, and the requirement to make do with whatever was available. Alice carried that crate, or she organized its carrying. She was the person who got the 5 children, and the 44 pieces of luggage, and the exiled husband aboard the British warship, and from the warship to France, and from France to the borrowed house in St. Cloud. 27 years old when she did the Balkan Wars nursing. She was 37 when she did the Calypso evacuation. 44 when she was taken to the Berlin clinic. She was 58 when she returned to Athens. She was 66 when Germany invaded and she stayed. She was 84 when she died in the palace. The same person, different circumstances. Same applied intelligence meeting each situation with the minimum necessary theatre and the maximum available competence. Crate is in the story because Philip told it. He told it with the sardonic detachment that was his characteristic mode for the difficult material. He had been the infant in the crate, and then the boy at boarding school, and then the naval officer, and then the consort. He had got on with each stage of it, and the getting on had cost him things he didn't talk about. And one of the things it had cost him was a full understanding of the woman who had organized the crate and everything that came before it, and everything that came after. He found out at 73, standing in Jerusalem. He was told that the woman who had carried him off a ship in a fruit box had also, when he was 22 years old and fighting in the Pacific, sheltered a Jewish family from the Gestapo for 13 months and never mentioned it. He planted a tree and came home. The trees are still there. grow in the Jerusalem summer. They will be there for a long time. She was born in 1885 and she died in 1969. In between, she was more things than the word princess contains. She was righteous among the nations. She was the holder of the Royal Red Cross from 1913. She was for a few months in the spring of 1931, woman who refused to speak to Ludwig Binswanger on her birthday because he was the person keeping her from her children. She was the woman in grey near the back of the nave. She was the woman on the third floor near the Gestapo headquarters. She was the woman who wrote to Philip, "I have taken a flat just for you and me." She was his mother. He was her son. Distance between them was most of a century, and the trees in Jerusalem are growing still.